My God, get ready, because this story scared even me. It almost made me regret living in the Ozarks. This story is titled Box Fan and was sent to me by a viewer named simply Jeb. In it, he recalls a series of bizarre childhood rules and events at his grandparents' mountain home in the Ozarks, which ultimately led to the most traumatic moment in his life, the moment he realized monsters are real. This is the Unexplained Encounters podcast. I sleep with the fan on every single night, regardless of the reason. No matter the temperature, a box fan runs on the floor next to my bed at full speed. My wife thinks it's a white noise thing, something to help me sleep. She's gotten used to it over the years. She bought me one of those sound machines for Christmas a couple years back. It plays ocean waves and rain and all that stuff, and I thanked her, but I put it in the closet and kept on using the fan. She never asked why, but I'm sure she wondered. I think she could tell by my face that I didn't want to explain. I'm 34 years old. I've slept with a box fan on since I was 11, and I'll probably sleep with one on until the day I die. This is not a comfort thing. At least, not in the way you expect. I've never told anyone the full version of what I'm about to write down. Not even my wife. I've explained parts, yeah, like during a particularly bad night terror that had me standing in the hallway at 3 a.m. with my hands against the wall, like I was bracing for something to hit the house, and my wife found me there, asking what I'd been dreaming about. I didn't remember, I said, but that was a lie. Not too long ago, my grandfather passed away. He was 91 years old, lived a full life, and had been in a wheelchair for the last 12 years. A stroke had taken most of his left side. At the funeral, I was standing by the coffee and those little crustless sandwiches that only exist at church receptions when my cousin Parker walked up, and without any preamble or greeting, he leaned in and said, "You remember that night?" It wasn't a question, and I didn't treat it like one. I simply nodded, and we stood still for a while, until his wife called him over to deal with one of his kids, and that was it. We haven't talked about it since, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't shake something loose. So here it is. My grandfather owned 130 acres in the Ozarks, most of it backed up to Mark Twain National Forest land, in a part of southern Missouri where the nearest grocery store was a 40-minute drive, and the nearest hospital was further than that. He had retired from the Missouri Pacific Railroad before I was born, and he spent his days doing whatever he wanted on that land, which mostly meant tinkering with small engines and sitting on his porch, growing tomatoes that he'd give away to anyone who stopped by. He was no farmer, though people sometimes assumed he was. He just had land, and he liked having it, and he kept it the way some men keep their guns, maintained and ready, though ready for what was never entirely clear to me as a child. The house was old, but solid. He and my grandmother had built it in 1961 with money he'd saved from the railroad, and it looked like what it was. A post-war rural home designed by people who valued function but had a limited interest in aesthetics. Single-story, partial basement, wood-paneled walls inside that had darkened over the decades to the color of strong tea. It smelled of coffee grounds and something chemically that I eventually identified as mothballs, which were stuffed into the closets. The porch wrapped around two sides and had a concrete floor that was always gritty underfoot. There were two rocking chairs out there that had worn smooth grooves into the concrete from decades of use. The property itself was mostly open yard around the house, maybe 2 acres of mowed grass, then the tree line on 3 sides. The fourth side was the gravel driveway, a quarter mile of loose rock that popped under tires, and announced every arrival long before you could see the vehicle. Beyond the driveway was just more trees. A barn sat about 200 yards from the house, listing to the south. It had stayed like that for as long as I'd been alive, as though it had decided 30 years ago how far it was willing to lean and had just committed to it. There was a creek that cut through the back portion of the property, where the woods thickened up, and in the summer it ran shallow enough to wade in, and deep enough in a few spots to sit down in up to your chest. Every summer, my parents sent me and my cousins out there for 2 or 3 weeks. Parker was 2 years older than me, fearless in a stupid way, and I say that with the most love possible. Leia was my age, quiet, and loved reading books more than anything. Sometimes baby Derek would come too. He was Aunt Diane's youngest, maybe 4 or 5 years old during the years I'm talking about, but he was mostly just a background presence, trailing after the rest of us and crying when he couldn't keep up. During the day, that property was the best place on earth. I genuinely believed that. We had the run of the entire 100+ acres, and we used every inch of it. I remember catching crawdads in the creek with our bare hands, racing them on the flat rocks. We explored that barn hundreds of times, which was full of old equipment and barn swallows, and rusty junk that felt like pirate treasure to a 9-year-old. Grandpa even had an old 3-wheeler ATV. Yeah, if you didn't know, you could get a 3-wheeler back then. They were a bit more common than what you might see today, because they were soon considered way too dangerous. But back then he would let Parker drive it around the property while the rest of us clung to the back like it was a mechanical bull. Grandma kept a drawer in the kitchen full of candy too. Off-brand candy though, mostly. Most of it being butterscotch discs and peppermints. But occasionally, if you're lucky, there would be Snickers in there, hidden away specifically for the kids. Those really were the good days. I want to be clear about that. Those days were genuinely wonderful. It was the nights that were different. I've spent a long time trying to articulate exactly how the shift happened each evening, and the best I can describe it is that my grandfather had an internal clock that the rest of us could not see or hear, and around 5 or 6 o'clock every day, it would go off, and he would become a different person. Now hold on there, he didn't get mean, he didn't yell or become harsh. He just sort of went somewhere else inside himself. You could see it in the way he moved. He would straighten up from whatever he was doing, and his eyes would go to the sky like he was reading something written up there in a language meant just for him. His jaw would start to clench repeatedly, and then he would herd all the kids inside. The rule was that we had to be in the house before the first star appeared in the sky. Not before sunset, which would have been reasonable, but before the first star. In June in Missouri, the sun doesn't fully set until around 9 o'clock, but the first stars can show up in the east while the western sky is still pale. And Grandpa knew this. He watched for them every night with a patience that bordered on obsession. He would sit on the porch in his rocking chair and face east, just waiting. And the moment he saw that first pinpoint of light, wherever we were on the property, he wanted us inside. If we were down at the creek, he'd ring the iron bell mounted on the porch post. A real cast iron bell, too, the kind you would see at old schoolhouses, and you could hear it across the entire property. That sound meant now. It did not mean start heading back. It didn't mean get an attitude or argue. It meant get your butt inside. Once inside, the house changed too. Grandpa would go room to room pulling down the blinds, and these were not typical blinds. Every window in that house had thick, opaque roller shades, the heavy kind that you might find in a dark room or a hospital room where a patient needed total darkness. They were mounted inside the window frames, and when you pulled them down, they sealed the glass almost completely. No light got in, and I suppose more importantly, no light got out. He pulled every single one of them down every single night, without exception, and we were not allowed to raise them or peek behind them until morning. He never explained why. It was simply the rule. And in that house, his rules had the weight of physics. You didn't question gravity, and you didn't question Grandpa. The doors were another thing. He had a deadbolt on every exterior door, which, for a rural house in the middle of nowhere, was already unusual. But the front door also had a chain lock and a sliding barrel bolt that he had installed himself, a heavy steel piece that seated into a bracket that he had lag bolted directly onto the door frame. Every night, I'd hear him making his rounds. The back door first, then the side door off the kitchen, then the front. Click, click, thunk, slide. The same order every time. The sounds of the house being sealed. And then there were the fans. Every bedroom had a box fan. The cheap kind you could grab at a hardware store for $12 or so, with plastic blades and a rattling motor, and 3 speed settings that were basically loud, louder, and broken sounding. In the room where the kids slept, a guest room with 2 twin beds and a folding cot, Grandpa would set the fan on a wooden chair between the beds and turn it on high before we went to bed. It roared. It pushed air around that didn't need pushing. The house did have central air conditioning that worked fine. The fan would dry out your eyes and your throat so that by morning you'd wake up feeling like you slept in a kiln. Parker hated it and complained about it every summer. Leia slept with a pillow over her face to block the wind. I would just pull the sheet up to my nose and breathed through the fabric, and I dealt with it. One summer, Parker asked Grandma directly why we had to sleep with the fans on. She said the house got stuffy at night and the fans helped circulate the air. Parker pointed out that the air conditioning was literally running, and Grandma gave him a look that was pleasant on the surface, but had something underneath it. Something that communicated very clearly that this line of questioning was finished. Then she said, "Your grandpa likes the fans on, so the fans stay on." And that they did. I understand now what the fans were for. I've understood this since I was 11. The fans were loud enough to cover the sounds from outside. Almost. That was their entire purpose. They were there so it was harder to hear what was walking around the house at night. I should tell you about the moon. There's a specific memory I keep coming back to, from a summer when I was 8 or maybe 9 years old. I was sitting on the porch with Grandpa after dinner, while the sky was doing its long summer fade from orange to purple, and the moon was rising in the east, enormous and nearly full, a deep amber color. I said something about it, like, "Look at that moon," or maybe, "The moon's huge tonight." At first, I didn't think my grandpa was going to say anything. He rocked in his chair and looked at the moon, and he didn't look happy about it, like I was. Eventually, he said to me, as if I wasn't even there, "I hate that damned thing." I thought he was joking around. I even laughed, but it came out awkward and forced. He didn't laugh. Over the years, I started to notice a pattern without fully understanding it. Grandpa was worse on certain nights, and it took me a long time to connect those nights to the moon because I was a kid and I wasn't tracking lunar cycles for fun. But looking back, the pattern was unmistakable. On nights when the moon was full, he was tense and vigilant, more alert than usual and more watchful, up later than Grandma. On nights where there was no moon at all, when the sky was just a black field of stars with no light to speak of, he was something else entirely. He was afraid. I don't think I had a word for it when I was young, but that's what it was. On moonless nights, my grandfather was a man in the grip of a real, grinding fear. He would check the locks more than once. He'd sit in the living room long after everyone else went to bed. And come morning, he would look gray and hollowed out, like someone who had spent the night awake and watching for something that might or might not come. Some nights, despite that fan, I could hear things. The fan covered a lot, yes, but it didn't cover everything. And on certain nights, there were footsteps outside that house. They were slow footsteps pacing around, like someone circling something else, taking their time. It would move along one side of the house, pause, sometimes right outside our bedroom window. A pause long enough that I'd be holding my breath in bed, eyes open, seeing nothing because of those blackout blinds, thankfully, and then continue on around the next side. When I mentioned it at breakfast once, doing my best to sound casual about it, Grandma would smile and said that Grandpa had trouble sleeping and he liked to walk the property at night. Said he was checking the animals in the barn to make sure nothing was getting into the feed. Parker, who was old enough by then to hear an explanation and measure it against what he actually believed, asked what exactly Grandpa was searching or checking for. Grandma changed the subject so smoothly, it was almost a magic trick, and before we knew it, we were talking about what we wanted for lunch. One night, I remember getting up to use the bathroom. I think I was 10 years old. The hallway was dark and the bathroom was on the far side of the living room, which meant I had to walk through the main part of the house to get there. As I passed through the living room, I stopped. Grandpa was in his recliner. The TV was off. Every light in the house was off. He was sitting perfectly upright with his deer rifle laid across his thighs, and his eyes were open, and he was staring at the front door. He didn't look at me. He didn't move. He did not acknowledge me in any way. He sat there like a man who had been sitting there for hours, and intended to sit there for hours more, watching that door with deadly focus, as if he expected it, or prayed that it wouldn't open. I went back to bed, and I listened to the fan and the footsteps outside, and I did not go back to sleep for a long time. The last thing I need to mention before I get to the rest of this is the basement. During the day, the basement was fair game. It was an unfinished space with concrete floor, cinder block walls, exposed ceiling joints, and it held the washer and dryer, a bunch of storage shelves, and a workbench Grandpa used for small projects. It had these narrow slit windows that sit at ground level from the outside, wider than they are tall, hinged at the top so they could swing inward for ventilation. During the day, Grandpa sometimes propped them up to air out the place. After dark, the basement, though, was off limits, and the way Grandpa communicated this was different from his other rules. Those other rules, the blinds, the fans, the inside before stars rule, those were enforced through routine. He just did them and you fell in line because that's how things worked. The basement rule was the only one he ever stated out loud, directly, looking right at us. He said, "You do not go in that basement after the sun goes down." And his face when he said it was not the face of a man setting a household boundary, but rather someone telling you not to put your hand into a running engine. He was not making a rule as much as he was describing a very real danger. For years, that's what summers were. The days were creek water and crawdads and the smell of cut grass and Grandma's fantastic cooking. But the nights were blackout blinds, locked doors, the drone of a box fan drowning out whatever moved in the dark outside. I accepted all of this. I was a kid. It was part of my world. Like Santa Claus, you accepted these kinds of things without analysis. This was Grandpa's house, and these were Grandpa's rules, and the world at Grandpa's house simply worked differently than it did at home. So I never really questioned it, and I followed every rule to the letter, right up until the summer I turned 11. That was the summer Grandpa had his stroke, when the rules came apart, and I finally truly learned what all of it had been for. Now, I know I said the last thing I would mention before the real story would be the basement thing, but there is one more thing I need to tell you before I get to what happened the summer I was 11. This is the story my grandfather told me on the porch. I was around 9 or 10. It was a full moon night. I remember that because the moon was the reason I was outside at all. I couldn't sleep despite the fan, or maybe because of it. My throat felt like sandpaper and I needed some water. When I padded out to the kitchen to get some, I could see through the gap at the bottom of the living room blinds. The porch was lit up silver white, bright enough to read by, and the front door was open to the screen. Obviously, this was all very bizarre. Grandpa never left doors open at night, never had the blinds in a way we could peek through them. But there he was on the other side of the screen door, sitting in his rocker, with the rifle across his knees, staring out at the yard and the tree line beyond it in all that cold moonlight. I pushed open the screen door and he looked at me. I expected him to tell me to go back to bed right away, but he didn't do that. He looked very tired. In fact, I'd never seen him so tired. And I want to say it wasn't like a sleepy kind of tired either. The man looked absolutely worn through, a tiredness that went beyond muscles. He studied me for a second, then he tipped his head toward the other rocking chair. I sat down in it with my feet dangling, because I was too short to reach the concrete. We sat there for a while without talking. The moon was so bright it threw hard shadows across the yard, and the tree line at the edge of the mowed grass looked like a wall someone had built out of pure blackness, but then backlit it from the inside with pale gray where the moonlight caught the upper canopy. It was beautiful enough to take your breath away. Every few seconds a bat would cut through the light above the yard, there and gone so quick it was like a glitch in your vision. Then Grandpa began to talk. He didn't look at me when he did, and he didn't raise his voice above a low murmur. It really looked like he was talking to himself rather than to me. He told me a story, and I'm going to relay it here the way I can remember it, which means it might have gaps or rough edges, because I was a child then when I heard it, and he was not a man who knew how to tell a story in any organized fashion. He was blunt and sparse, with a lot left out that he either assumed you'd fill in or preferred you didn't. So here goes. When my grandfather was young, 20 or 21, he said, something had started getting into the livestock on the properties around his family's land. His father, my great-grandfather, raised cattle, and a few of the neighboring families had cattle or hogs or both. Over the span of maybe a month, animals started to turn up dead in the fields and pens, and from the way Grandpa described it, dead was putting it generously. He said the animals were taken apart. He used that phrase specifically. Taken apart. Like a mechanic taking apart an engine. Pieces here, pieces there. Organs separated from the body and moved to places they shouldn't be. He said one of the neighbor's heifers was found with its rib cage opened up and emptied out, with the contents arranged in the grass beside it, in what he called a kind of order, though he wouldn't say what that meant, and I wasn't asking. I remember thinking, how is he telling a kid my age all of this? But he kept going. The initial assumption was dogs. Feral dogs were a real problem in that part of the Ozarks. Packs of them could form up out of strays and dumped pets. They could bring down a calf if they were hungry and numerous enough. But the men who looked at the remains said it wasn't dogs, and it wasn't coyotes either. Because dogs and coyotes are messy, frantic killers that tear into whatever they can reach and leave a scattered wreck. Whatever was doing this, it was doing it with a kind of deliberateness, and that did not match any predator that they knew of. Grandpa said his father came back from examining one of the kills and sat at the kitchen table, completely silent. When Grandpa's mother asked him what was wrong, he simply said, "Something's pulling them apart with its hands." Now, nobody called the game warden or the sheriff. This was the rural Ozarks in the early 1950s. These men solved their own problems. My great-grandfather organized a hunt. He put the word out to the surrounding families. Grandpa's Uncle Earl, 2 men from the next property over whose names I've long forgotten, or maybe I never knew, and a cousin of some kind, who I think was only there mostly because he owned dogs that had been used for tracking boar. In total, there were 5, maybe 6 men, including my grandfather, who was the youngest at the time, and was allowed to come because he owned a rifle too, and knew how to use it. and because his father was not the kind of man you argued with successfully. They went out on a night when the livestock killings had been at their worst. Grandpa said they waited for the moon to be up so they'd have light. They brought rifles and lanterns and the tracking dogs, 2 of them, big bony hounds with scarred up ears, and they went into the trees behind my great-grandfather's property at around 10 o'clock at night. Grandpa told me about this part of the hunt in pieces, and some of what he said I've had to reconstruct from what I remember and what makes sense in context. Because, like I said, he was not a natural storyteller, and I was a kid, sitting in the dark, trying to follow an old man's fragmented account of something that happened 40 years before I was born. The dogs lasted about an hour. They went in eager, excited hounds with a scent to follow, heads down and pulling against their leads. But then they stopped, both of them, at nearly the same time. They froze where they stood and began shaking. Grandpa said one of them urinated on itself. They refused to move forward, and they refused to stay quiet. They started to make a sound that he described as a continuous whine, high and thin. Not a game call, but something from when it's gone beyond fear into a place where its brain had stopped working properly. One of the dogs ripped free of its lead and bolted off. They heard it crashing through the underbrush for about 30 seconds, and then the sound faded and they never found that dog. The remaining hound pressed itself against its owner's legs and had to be dragged along for the rest of the night, like a piece of furniture. So after the dogs became useless, the men kept going on their own. They were deep in the timber by this point, in that old-growth Ozark woodland where the canopy closes overhead and the moonlight comes through in patches. Everything between those patches is ink dark. Grandpa said they could hear something moving in the trees around them. He was specific about this part. He said it wasn't moving through the underbrush like a deer or a boar would, pushing through branches at ground level. It was moving above them, in the canopy. He said they could hear branches creaking and snapping up high, the sound of something heavy transferring its weight from limb to limb, and it was fast, much faster than walking pace. He said it circled them for a while, up there in the dark above the lantern light, and the sound of it was like a man running on all fours across treetops, which is an image I've never been able to get out of my head, even though I heard this sitting on a porch 20-some years ago. They kept moving because they were men who had committed to doing something, and because turning back now would have meant walking through the same stretch of forest they had just come through, and whatever was pacing them in the canopy would have still been there. Grandpa said they walked for maybe another half hour with the sound above them coming and going, sometimes close enough that debris would fall on them, small twigs and bark and pieces of leaf. Other times far enough away that they nearly convinced themselves it had gone. The remaining dog had given up walking entirely and was being carried by its owner. Then, the thing came down out of the trees. Grandpa didn't describe this like a dramatic moment. He said it matter-of-factly, like someone saying it started to rain. The crashing above them stopped, and there was a heavy sound about 40 yards ahead of them, like something landing on the ground from a great height. Then, silence. It was Uncle Earl who saw it first. Earl was at the front of the group, a few paces ahead of the others, carrying a lantern in one hand and his rifle in the other. He stopped walking and said very low without turning around, "It's standing up." Grandpa raised his lantern. At the far edge of the light, about 30 yards out where the glow gave way to solid dark, he could see a shape between 2 trees. He said it was tall, taller than any of them, and Earl was over 6 feet. It was standing on 2 legs and it was perfectly still. The lantern light was too weak at that distance to give him anything more than an outline, but he said the outline was enough. He said it looked like someone had taken the general idea of a person and built it after stretching the measurements. He said the head sat forward on the neck, reminding him more of a vulture, with a long-looking snout or perhaps a nose, and its shoulders were enormous, far too wide for the head they supported. The arms hung past where arms should stop. Then it dropped forward onto all fours, and it was gone. The sound of its movement exploded back into the canopy above them, crashing through the branches heading north, fast and getting farther away. The men stood there in a circle of lantern light with their rifles up, and nobody said anything for what Grandpa estimated was about 2 full minutes. They should have gone home. They all knew that. But they didn't, because Uncle Earl said the thing was heading toward the Dawson property, where cattle had been killed the week prior. And because these were Ozark men in the 1950s, and going home would have been something they'd have to live with for a long time, they followed. The timber got worse as they went north. The terrain broke up into ridges and draws and rocky shelves where the footing was bad even in daylight, and the men started to spread out because you couldn't walk 6 abreast through that kind of country. They kept in contact by calling to each other. Grandpa said his father would shout, and the others would shout back, a kind of roll call every few minutes to make sure nobody had fallen or gotten turned around. The thing in the canopy had gone quiet, or at least they couldn't hear it over the sound of their own movement across the rough ground. Suddenly, there was a gunshot, a single sharp crack that bounced off the ridge walls and came from the east, from Uncle Earl's direction, because Earl had drifted the furthest from the group. Grandpa said everyone stopped where they were, and in the silence after the shot, they heard Earl screaming. He was far enough away that the sound was thin and echoing and hard to locate precisely, but it was unmistakably a man screaming in a register that Grandpa said he'd never heard from a grown person before, and never heard again after. Then there was a second shot, which cut off the screaming. Then nothing, just the trees in the dark, and all of them standing in it. For some time, Grandpa went quiet after he told me that part. He rocked in his chair and looked at the moon, and his hands were still on the rifle across his lap. I could see that even decades later, the memory of that silence after the second shot was costing him something to sit with. I waited because even at 9 or 10, I understood that you don't interrupt a man when he's in a place like that. When he started again, his voice was flatter. He said they'd found Earl's rifle at the bottom of a draw, wedged between 2 rocks. It had been fired twice, both rounds spent. There was blood on the rocks and on the ground, a lot of it, and there were drag marks leading down into a ravine so choked with brush and fallen timber that they couldn't push through it in the dark. They stood at the edge of that ravine, calling Earl's name until the sky started to lighten up in the east. My grandfather didn't tell me what they found when they went back in daylight. He said, "They told his wife it was an animal attack." I noticed that phrasing even then, young as I was. They told her. He didn't say it was an animal attack. He told me what they told her it was, and the gap between those two things was wide enough to fall into. The official family story, the one I'd heard at Thanksgiving tables and funerals my whole life, without knowing it had any connection to my grandfather's property, was that Earl had died in a hunting accident, had shot himself, and by the time the search party had reached him, animals had gotten to the remains. A tragedy, but the kind of tragedy that happened in the rural Ozarks. People accepted it because it was the kind of thing that could be accepted. Grandpa sat with me for a while longer after he finished. The moon had moved since he'd started talking, and the shadows in the yard had shifted with it. The tree line looked different than before. Not to say it was menacing, exactly, but more aware, like when you walk in a room and you didn't know that someone was in there, and they never announced themselves. You simply see them suddenly. Eventually, he looked at me, and his eyes were clear and direct. He said, "There's something in those woods that doesn't have a name, and it's smarter than you want it to be. That's why we have the rules. You understand?" I nodded. "The worst nights are the new moons," he said. "On a full moon, you can see it coming. On a new moon, it can see you, and you can't see a thing." He told me to go back to bed then, and I went. I pulled the sheet up to my nose, and I listened to the box fan roar. But I did not go back to sleep that night. In the morning, I looked out the window at the tree line in the early sunlight. It was just trees, the very same trees I'd played under the day before. But now they meant something completely different. After that night on the porch, I never doubted or wondered about the rules again. I would pull the blinds down myself, turn the fan on before anyone told me to, and I would be the first inside before the first star even showed, every single time without being asked. The footsteps outside some nights that Grandma said were Grandpa checking on the animals. I knew what those were now. My grandfather was not inspecting the barn. Grandpa wasn't even outside. Something in those woods had taken my grandfather's uncle apart in a ravine 40 years ago, and it was still here. I understood the rules. I followed the rules, and those rules kept us safe every summer of my childhood, until the summer my grandfather collapsed in his kitchen with a mug of coffee shattering on the linoleum and the left side of his body going slack. Suddenly, the only person who truly knew what the rules were for was unconscious and driven to a hospital. Grandpa's stroke happened one morning in the middle of our second week during that stay. He was standing at the counter pouring coffee from the percolator, the same thing he did every morning at the same time, and his left hand simply opened on its own and let the mug fall. It hit the floor, breaking into 3 pieces, and coffee went everywhere. Grandpa looked down at it, then looked at Grandma and said, "Joyce, there's something wrong with my arm." Then he sat down in a kitchen chair heavily, like someone had increased the gravity in the room, and the left side of his face slid downward and stayed there. Grandma called 911. She called Aunt Diane too, who lived 4 hours away in the suburbs outside St. Louis. Then she did what she could, which was to hold Grandpa's right hand and talk to him in a steady voice while the 3 of us stood in the kitchen doorway, watching, not knowing what to do with ourselves. I remember that the ambulance took a long time to get there. That's how far out we were from anything. They loaded Grandpa onto a stretcher. He looked so small and frail. I remember thinking that my grandpa might die, and I was scared. This man, who had been the largest presence in every room he ever entered, now looked like a gray-faced old man with only one working hand. Grandma couldn't go with him, not until Aunt Diane came, and once Aunt Diane showed up, Grandma left in a hurry. I remember just after she left, looking at the blinds on the windows, thinking that no one in this house would know to pull them down, and why. Aunt Diane and her husband Cal arrived around 3 in the afternoon, hugging Grandma and wishing her and Grandpa the best as she left. Aunt Diane was Grandpa's youngest daughter, a very sweet woman with a loud laugh who worked as an office manager somewhere. She drove a minivan and had probably not spent a full night in this house in 15 years. Uncle Cal was fine, a big, soft-spoken guy who sold insurance and was decent with kids. He gave lots of those cheesy kid compliments and high fives, like, "Good job, sport," that kind of thing. They were the kind of adults you'd want around during a family emergency, for sure. Warm and capable. Aunt Diane spent most of the evening on the phone with the hospital and with other relatives, leading a sort of crisis management with the family. Uncle Cal ordered pizza from the one place that would actually deliver that far out, which took over an hour. He even let us eat it in the living room in front of the TV. which Grandma never allowed. That first evening, I kept waiting for someone to start the routine, hoping someone was watching the sky and would call us inside if we were outside, or go room to room with the blinds, setting up fans, locking doors. But nobody did. The sun went down and the windows stayed uncovered, and the doors stayed latched with their regular locks, not with the deadbolts. No chain, no barrel bolt, nothing. The fans stayed in the closet where Grandma stored them during the day. That house felt utterly naked, like a body without skin. Everything that was supposed to be protected was now open and exposed to whatever was out there. I almost said something. I stood in the hallway and rehearsed it in my head. Something about how Grandpa liked the blinds down and the fans on. Something casual that wouldn't require me to explain why. But I couldn't figure out how to say it without sounding strange. I was 11 years old, but the weight of adult attention during a crisis was paralyzing, so I didn't say anything. I went to bed in the guest room with Parker and Leia. The window was uncovered, and the fan was off. I lay there in the most awkward silence, so enormous and wrong, I could hear my own heartbeat. I slept eventually. The following day was almost normal. Uncle Cal took us outside. We rode the three-wheeler and threw rocks in the creek, and Aunt Diane drove to the hospital, coming back in the late afternoon with a cautiously optimistic report. Grandpa was stable, responsive, but they were keeping him for observation and tests. There was also talk of moving him to a larger facility in Springfield. She looked exhausted. Uncle Cal made spaghetti for dinner. It was watery and undersalted, but we all ate it. Nobody had the energy to care about food quality at the time. That evening, Parker pulled me and Leia aside in the hallway. I could tell he was being very sneaky about something. "They don't care what we do," he said, meaning Aunt Diane and Uncle Cal, who were back on the phone in the master bedroom with the door mostly shut. "We should stay outside tonight, after dark. We're never going to get that chance again." Leia looked at me. I could tell she wanted me to say no so she wouldn't have to. And I nearly did. But Parker was 13 and I was 11. At that age, that's a big gap. And some part of me, the side that was tired of being so afraid every summer, tired of the fans and the blinds and the locked down feeling of Grandpa's nighttime house, that side wanted to know what the property was like after dark. I'd spent years sealed inside while the world outside continued without me, and I wanted to see it. So I said okay, and Leia said okay because I had, and Parker grinned. We went out the back door at around 8:30, with the sky still holding on to the last orange glow in the west, but the east had already gone to deep blue. The very first thing that struck me was how different the property sounded at night. The creek, which was a pleasant background murmur during the day, was loud, more present, so to speak, in the dark, even aggressive sounding. The bugs were deafening, a whole wall of sound from every direction, cicadas and crickets and tree frogs layering over each other in a pulsing roar that seemed to breathe. And underneath all that was the woods. The tree line was about 60 yards from where we stood at the back of the house, and in the dying light, it looked solid, a dark mass without depth or detail. We had flashlights, 2 of them, from the kitchen junk drawer, but both were so weak that they barely reached 20 feet. Parker swept his across the yard like a searchlight. It revealed a narrow cone of grass and bugs, but nothing more. Beyond that cone was just more dark. He started to walk toward the tree line. Leia and I followed, too scared to be away from our oldest member. For about 20 minutes, it was what Parker had promised, an adventure. We walked along the edge of the trees without going in, shining our flashlights into the first few yards of timber, seeing trunks and underbrush. Occasionally, we found a pair of tiny reflective eyes, probably belonging to some small or low-to-the-ground raccoon or possum. Parker kept up a running commentary during this, about how this wasn't even scary, and that Grandpa's rules were just an old man being paranoid. I let him say those things because I simply didn't know what to say, and I liked the lack of silence. Suddenly, Leia stopped. She was slightly behind me and to my left. When I turned around, she was standing very still with her flashlight pointed at the tree line, about 40 yards south of where we were. Her flashlight was weak, and it barely reached the trees at that distance. But at the very edge of its throw, where the light gave up and the dark took over again, there was a shape between two trunks that I could not make sense of. It was taller than any of us by a significant margin. It was also narrow, standing on two legs, but it was completely motionless. The flashlight was much too dim to give any texture or color, so it remained a silhouette, a vertical interruption in the pattern of the trees behind it, and it was facing us. "Something standing there," Leia said. Her voice was perfectly calm. Parker swung his flashlight toward it. For half a second, both beams hit roughly the same area, and in that combined light, I saw, or I thought I saw, the shape shift, a sudden movement, quickly, like something rearranging its posture. Leia's light flickered then. These were cheap, battery-powered flashlights. In that half-second of reduced light, the shape was gone. Just trees. Just ordinary dark between tree trunks. Parker said it was a deer. He said it with enough conviction that I knew he didn't believe it. And I think Leia knew too, because she was already walking toward the house, and she was walking fast. We followed her, and how we kept from actually full-on running, I have no idea. Perhaps we were too scared to run, but we walked at a pace that was as close to running as you could get. And when we made it to the back door and went inside, shutting it behind us, Parker locked the knob lock and then stood there looking at the deadbolt above it. He looks at us, then half laughs, saying, "It'll be fine." So we left it unlocked, and we didn't say anything else about it. We stood in the kitchen, breathing harder than the walk justified, and Parker then said, "That was fun." But Leia and I stayed quiet. He then said, "We should sleep down in the basement tonight." I felt my stomach drop when he said it. The basement was the other role, the one Grandpa had spoken out loud with his eyes locked on mine, and hearing Parker propose breaking it felt like hearing someone suggest swimming in a river during a storm. But Parker was already talking about it like it was decided. He'd seen the old Nintendo down there, he said, when Aunt Diane had gone down to do laundry earlier. And there were games, and probably other stuff. And the basement was cool, and it would be like a fort. And he reiterated, when would we get another chance? I looked at Leia. She had her arms crossed over her chest, and she was staring at the floor. We were both wondering the same thing, I think. How much resistance was worth the cost of Parker's ridicule? She must have arrived at the same answer I did, because she shrugged one shoulder and said, "Whatever." And Parker took that as unanimous consent and started gathering supplies. We brought sleeping bags and pillows from the guest room. Parker grabbed a bag of chips and 3 cans of Coke from the fridge. Leia brought a book, which was optimistic. We trooped down the wooden stairs into the basement, and Parker pulled the chain on the single bare bulb at the bottom. The room came to life in harsh yellowish light. Everything else was concrete and shadow. Honestly, for a few hours though, it was great. Parker found the NES under the workbench, still connected to a small TV that must have been old when Reagan was president, and after 20 minutes of blowing into cartridges and fiddling with the AV cables, he got it to work. We played Excitebike, then Duck Hunt without the light gun, just using the controller, which didn't work perfectly, but we didn't mind. Leia found a stack of board games on a shelf, Sorry and Clue and something called Aggravation that none of us had ever heard of. We played Clue on the concrete floor with the chips and soda spread around us, like we were having a picnic, Parker discovered a cabinet near the water heater that contained, among other things, a collection of candy so old that some of it was in packaging I didn't recognize. We tried a few pieces. They tasted like sweetened chalk. We ate them anyway, because adventure was the whole point. Really, it was the most fun I'd had at that house in years, maybe ever. We were loud and stupid and free, and Aunt Diane and Uncle Cal never came down to check on us. For those few hours, the basement was just a basement, and the rules we were used to, they were just the eccentricities of an old man who was currently in a hospital bed 40 minutes away with tubes in his arm. We fell asleep in stages. Leia went first. She had set up her sleeping bag near the base of the stairs and was out cold by midnight. Parker lasted a little longer on the sagging couch against the far wall, talking to me about a girl from his school, while his sentences got slower and more fragmented, until they stopped entirely, and his breathing evened out. I lay in my sleeping bag in the middle of the floor. I was between the two of them, looking up at the ceiling joists and the cobwebs, listening to the silence. No fan, just silence. I hadn't really thought about that part until that very moment. I'd been distracted by the games and the food and the novelty of it all. But lying there in the dark after Parker killed the light, the silence of that basement was absolute. No fan roar to fill the space, and no white noise to blur the edges of whatever sounds the night might be making. There was, though, the faint ticking of the water heater, and the even fainter hum of the electrical panel on the wall. But beyond that, nothing. I listened to my cousin's breathing. It was so dark and so quiet. It felt like I was deep, deep underwater. Eventually, and I don't know when, I fell asleep. But when I woke up, I was very cold. Genuinely cold. A damp chill had gotten through the sleeping bag and into my skin. It made no sense because it was July in Missouri, and the basement had been stuffy and warm when we'd come down. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around myself. That's when I felt the draft. Moving air coming from somewhere to my left, carrying a smell that did not belong in that basement. The green, wet smell of outside, of grass and dirt and night air, and underneath it was something else. A warm and sour and biological smell. It reminded me of a dog's breath, but heavier and denser, more concentrated. One of the slit windows was open. I couldn't see it. I couldn't see it. The dark in that basement was the most complete dark I'd ever experienced, where open and closed eyes were the same thing. But I could feel the outside air coming through it. I could feel that the air was wrong, that it carried the heat and smell of something that was not the night. And every hair on my body stood up at once. I heard it before I could even make sense of it. Breathing. Low and wet, raspy on the exhale. A large animal trying to keep quiet. Something was in the room with us. Something was inside the basement. And it was breathing. It was close. I stopped moving, and I stopped breathing. Every muscle in my body locked into a rigid, frozen state that I did not choose and could not have overridden if I'd tried. My higher brain, the part that reasons and plans and makes decisions, had been disconnected from the controls entirely, and what was running me now was something much older, much simpler. Something that said to me, "You must not move. You must not breathe. You must no longer exist." The breathing shifted. It moved through the room, slowly, with a carefulness that was worse than speed, because speed would mean a panicked animal, and this was not panicked. It was methodical. And beneath that breathing, accompanying it, I heard the footsteps, a light, clicking, tapping cadence on the concrete floor. The sound of something with claws, walking on a hard surface, and the rhythm. It didn't match anything that walks on two legs, but it didn't quite match anything that walks on four. The sound of it moving across the concrete floor in the perfect dark was the most alien and dislocating thing I've ever heard. It moved past me, close enough that I could feel warmth coming off of it, the radiant body heat of something large and very alive, and I caught a wave of that smell, that sour, biological, overly wet dog smell. But up close, it was sharper, and there was more underneath it, something that reminded me of blood. It passed within what had to be 2 or 3 feet of my sleeping bag, and I lay there with my eyes wide open in the dark, and I saw absolutely nothing. I felt it go by me, like a weather system. Then it stopped, near the couch where Parker had been sleeping. I heard the breathing change then, faster, shorter, with a sniffing quality, like it was sampling the air around him. Then it moved again, toward the stairs, toward Leia. It stopped. The breathing was maybe 4 feet from my head, 4 feet from Leia's sleeping bag at the base of the stairs. I could hear her slow, unconscious breathing, and the thing's breathing layered over it, and for a span of time that I cannot accurately estimate. Was it 5 seconds, 30, a full minute? Those were the only sounds in the world. Then the thing made a sound, a low and soft sound from deep in its chest, barely louder than the breathing. It wasn't a growl, and it wasn't a whine. It sat somewhere between the two, carrying an emotion I should not have been able to read, but I could. It was interested. Whatever was standing over my cousin in the dark was curious about her. Leia shifted in her sleeping bag, a small unconscious movement, the kind of half-roll that sleeping people do, and she made a sound. A murmur, maybe a fragment of a dream, nothing coherent. But then her eyes opened. No, I couldn't see it. I knew because she spoke then. Her voice was muzzy and confused and half asleep, and I heard her say, "Is that a dog? Who let a—" The rest of her sentence was replaced by a sound that I will hear for the rest of my life. A sudden detonation of movement, claws scrabbling on concrete, a heavy, wet impact of a body hitting the sleeping bag, and the sound of the bag being seized and wrenched sideways across the floor so quickly that Leia's confused question turned into a scream that did not sound like language or even a human voice anymore. Just a raw and primal shriek of an animal in terror. It bounced off the concrete walls, filling the basement from floor to ceiling. I heard the sleeping bag dragging, fast, impossibly fast, scraping across the concrete toward the far wall where the open window was. Trust me, I would soon know where that open window was exactly. I could hear Leia thrashing about inside the sleeping bag. The thing had hold of the outside of it and was pulling her. I could hear the fabric tearing in long, ripping sounds as claws and teeth shredded through the outer shell. Parker was screaming from the couch, "What's happening?" And somewhere above us, through the ceiling, I heard the concussive thud of adult feet hitting the floor and running. The dragging reached the wall, and there was a different sound. The sleeping bag being hauled upward, lifted off the ground toward the slit window. The window frame groaned. Leia was screaming in short, breathless bursts, and I could hear the fabric of the sleeping bag catching at the edges of the window, tearing further. I understood, with a sick, lurching horror, that whatever had her was trying to pull her through that window, An 18-inch wide slit window 4 feet off the basement floor on the inside, but ground level on the outside. Something out there was hauling a child in a sleeping bag up the wall, attempting to drag her through it with the disturbing strength of something I don't want to share a world with. The basement light suddenly came on. Aunt Diane had hit the switch at the top of the stairs, and the bare bulb exploded the room back into existence. Every detail was harsh and yellow again, and suddenly, violently real. I saw the basement. The scattered sleeping bags and the crushed chip bag. The Ness still connected to the silent TV. Parker was now standing on top of the couch, his back against the wall. His face was white and his mouth was wide open. His hands were up near his chest, like he was bracing for a hit. And across the room, against the far wall, there was Leia's sleeping bag, hanging. The top half was wedged into the open slit window, pulled upward and bunched into the narrow frame. The bottom half hung down the wall, limp, with Leia's weight inside it, sagging toward the floor. The bag was shredded in long lines, 4 slashes evenly spaced across, and through the tears I could see the color of Leia's pajamas and even the skin of her arm. She wasn't moving or screaming anymore. She had gone silent, so absolutely terrified she'd stopped moving. Then the bag dropped. Whatever had been holding it from outside released it all at once, and Leia and the sleeping bag collapsed to the basement floor in a heap. From outside the window, inches away, just on the other side of that ground-level slit, I heard something move, a single heavy thud, the sound of a large animal pushing off the grass, heading back for the tree line, leaving us there in the aftermath. Uncle Cal came down the stairs 3 at a time, his face aghast. He grabbed Leia off the floor, sleeping bag and all, and carried her rapidly up the stairs. Aunt Diane was behind him, one hand on the wall, the other over her mouth, asking questions. Parker scrambled off the couch and ran for the stairs. I saw him glancing at the still open window several times as he did. I was the last one up. As I reached the bottom step, I too turned and looked back at that window. It was still open, swinging slightly inward on its hinge. Beyond it, through the narrow rectangle of the opening, I could see a strip of the yard due to the light that spilled out from the basement. There was grass, the first few feet of ground outside, and at the edge of the light already pulling back into the dark, there was a pair of eyes. They were low to the ground and caught the basement light like an animal's. A yellow reflective shine. They were close together, but that's all I could see due to the dark. They looked at me for less than a second, but then they were gone, and I swear I could hear the sound of something moving fast through the woods. I ran up the stairs, and I didn't go back down. Leia was physically fine. There were some light scratches from the window frame on her arms and shoulders, a bruise across her ribs where she'd been pinned inside the sleeping bag as it was pulled against the narrow opening. But nothing was broken, nothing that would leave a scar on the outside. Uncle Cal went out with a flashlight, walking the perimeter of the house, while Aunt Diane sat with us in the living room with every light on. Uncle Cal came back about 15 minutes later, said he couldn't find a thing. He started to explain it. It was a bear, he said, attracted to the smell of the food we'd brought down there. And I could see in his face that he was constructing something that he could believe, not something that was currently true, but something that would become true. There was no more sleep to be had that night. We stayed up in the living room together until dawn, with the TV on and the volume up, every light on in the house. Leia sat in the corner of the couch with her knees pulled to her chest and did not speak. nor would she speak in the morning or the morning after that, and she would not talk to me or the rest of us for the remainder of that summer. Aunt Diane called the hospital that night. She was in the kitchen and she was keeping her voice low, but I was in the hallway and I heard most of it. She described what happened. She used the word animal several times and the word window several more. When she stopped, there was some silence, long enough that Aunt Diane said, "Mom, are you there?" But then my grandmother's voice came through, and I could hear what she asked. She had said, "Were the windows closed?" That was her first question. Not if Leia was okay, or what happened, but about the windows. It was like she knew exactly what would have happened if the windows were not locked, or if someone had gone down into the basement where the windows didn't lock. Grandma, like Grandpa, probably knew what was out there, but did not have the first-hand experience like Grandpa had. Grandpa would not have forgotten to lock the place down. But Grandma, in a panic, well, I can't blame her. This was not her fault. I really can't say it was anyone's fault. We were driven home 2 days later. Our summer was over. I hope that makes you understand why the sound of a box fan brings me some sort of comfort, or security might be a better word, because my mind has subconsciously associated things with that event. It knows that before the attack, there was box fan noise when we slept, but on the night of the attack, there was none. So until the day I die, there will be a box fan running full blast in my room, because I do not want to hear what's lurking outside my window. What in the world was that? What kind of creature resembles a thin and sickly werewolf, but can fit through a thin window to drag away children? This story is going to give me nightmares for weeks to come. Good night. Thank you all so much for joining me on my podcast here, called Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. You can listen to and review Unexplained Encounters on your favorite podcast app, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts and so on. It's super helpful. You can find all my narrations on YouTube at Darkness Prevails. Until next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one. I can't wait, because mine and Carmen Carrion's new book, Freaky Folklore, Terrifying Tales of the World's Most Elusive Monsters and Enigmatic Cryptids, is coming July 16th, featuring the history and lore of terrifying folklore creatures from across the globe, alongside some cool and creepy illustrations. Pre-order today on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or your favorite bookstore, or go to eeriecast.com/freak. The next 1,000 verified pre-orders will get a Freaky Folklore decal and a 3-month subscription code to EerieCast Plus, and all entrants will get a free PDF sneak peek of the Freaky Folklore book. To verify and for more info, go to eeriecast.com/freak. Send your scariest workplace stories to us at eeriecast.com/submit, and rate and review Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Papers, please. No, I don't want your receipt, you goofball. I'm talking about your traveling papers, because today I've got some delightfully juicy Border Patrol stories to share with you. We already know that crazy and often scary things happen at the border, north or south. But what you didn't know is just how absolutely weird it gets out there. Believe these stories or not, but do make sure to enjoy your coffee. These are tales from the break room. He never came back. From Darter 10. I worked as a Border Patrol agent for several years before taking a desk job instead. It was a tough job. Long hours and often unforgiving conditions. Not to mention, it seems like nobody likes you for what you do. You also saw a lot of things out there in the desert. Things that can shake even the most seasoned agent. But there was one series of events, one particular partner, that I'll never forget. It's a story I don't tell often, but when I do, people tend to look at me a little differently afterwards. The ones that believe me look at the desert a little differently too. About 5 years ago, I was stationed down near the border in one of the most remote stretches of our patrol area. It was the kind of place where the night sky is so clear, you feel like you can reach out and touch the stars. But that kind of clarity also brings a sort of emptiness with it. I just feel like it can play tricks on your mind, make you see and hear things that aren't there. Or maybe they are there, maybe we're just not equipped to understand it. My partner at the time was a guy I'll call Mike. He was a few years younger than me, still relatively new to the job. But Mike was sharp, and he had good instincts. We got along well too, which meant a lot for this job. We passed the long nights with idle chatter and some bad jokes. It was on one of those night patrols that things started to get strange. We were driving along the border fence, scanning the darkness with our spotlight, when Mike suddenly went rigid. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice tense. I turned down the crackly radio. Hear what?" "That whistling. It sounded close, like it was coming from just on the other side of the fence." I listened hard, but all I could hear was the hum of the engine and the wind whistling past our SUV. "I don't hear a thing. Maybe you heard the wind." Mike shook his head. "No, it was different. It sounded, I don't know, human." We sat in silence for a few minutes, straining our ears. But the night remained quiet beyond our vehicle, undisturbed. Finally, Mike sighed and leaned back in his seat. Maybe you're right. Things just feel weird out here sometimes." A few nights later, it happened again. This time we were out on foot, checking a sensor which had been tripped near a known smuggling route. As we hiked through the scrubby brush, I heard it. A clear, melodic whistle. Reminded me of a bird call, but not quite. It was coming from a stand of trees about 50 yards to our left. I glanced at Mike and saw him frozen there, his hand on his sidearm. He met my eyes, and I could see the same unease that I felt reflected back at me. Without a word, we changed course, moving cautiously towards this sound. As we got closer, the whistling stopped. The night was suddenly eerily silent. Even the usual chorus of insects and night birds had gone quiet. We switched on our flashlights, sweeping the beams over the gnarled trunks and spiny undergrowth. We then saw something. Just for a second, at the very edge of the light, a figure, pale and unnaturally thin, darting between the trees. Whatever it was, whoever it was, they were there and gone so fast, I nearly convinced myself I had imagined it. But then I heard Mike's sharp intake of breath. "Did you see that?" His voice was barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. We pressed forward, more urgently now. But no matter how quickly we moved, the figure and its noises seemed to stay just ahead of us, its form flitting in and out of sight, like some sort of ghost. The whole time that eerie whistling wound through the trees, also always seeming to come from just ahead of us. Eventually, we burst into a small clearing and stopped dead. There in the center of the open space was a perfect circle of stones. They had been arranged way too neatly to be natural, each one placed with obvious intention. In the center of that circle, the dirt had been disturbed, like something had been buried there. We looked at one another, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Neither of us were superstitious men, but there was definitely something about that circle. about the whole night even, that felt wrong. To me, it was like we had intruded on something we weren't supposed to see. Without a word, we backed out of the clearing and returned to the SUV. We didn't talk about what we'd seen. Not on the drive back, not in the locker room as we changed out of our uniforms. But I could tell it was weighing on Mike. He was quieter on our patrols after that, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows. A few weeks went by without incident. We started to relax, convincing ourselves it had just been a weird night, a trick of the light and the mind. But then we got a call. A sensor had been tripped out in the desert. It wasn't far from where we'd seen the stone circle. That shift, when the sensors were nearby, we were taking turns going to check it out alone, because most of the sensors there didn't allow travel by SUV, not unless you wanted to risk tearing up the vehicle and getting written up for it. So it was Mike's turn to check it out. He gave me a long look as he climbed out of the SUV, like he wanted to say something, but in the end, he just shook his head and trudged off into the night, his flashlight bobbing in the darkness. I waited for him to come back. 5 minutes, 10, 15. The radio stayed silent. A feeling of anxiety began to grow in my gut. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my gear and set off in the direction Mike had gone. When I couldn't find him, I began to call out his name into the night. I found his flashlight first. It was lying in the dirt, still switched on. A few feet away was his radio, followed by his hat. But no sign of Mike. It was like he had simply vanished into the desert. I ran back and called it in, my voice shaking. Within an hour, the area was swarming with agents, search dogs, helicopters. But as the night wore on and the sun rose, there was still no trace of Mike. It was like the desert swallowed him whole. The official report said that he must have gotten disoriented, that he wandered off, got lost. But I knew Mike. I knew he wasn't the type to just wander off, and I couldn't shake the memory of that pale figure we'd seen in the trees and that perfect circle of stones. It wasn't until a few days later that they found it. Mike's belt, coiled neatly on a rock about a mile from where he disappeared. And sitting on top of it, glinting in the sun, were two small metal objects. I saw the pictures. Took me a moment to recognize them. Tooth fillings. Both of Mike's tooth fillings. I knew for sure then Mike hadn't simply disappeared. He was taken. And a feeling deep inside of me, one that I couldn't talk about, said that Mike had been taken by something not so human. Possibly the same thing responsible for the circle of stones. A normal animal wouldn't just pluck the fillings from a man's teeth and neatly arrange his belt around a rock. This was something else. Something that I can't explain, can't understand. It didn't take me long after that to transfer out of the sector. I took a desk job instead, spent more time with my family. But I've never forgotten that night, and I never did stop wondering what really happened to Mike out there in the desert. It kills me inside, thinking that Mike is now just another ghost story. A real man with real feelings, his own family, now just a legend that agents tell each other about the worst that can happen out there. If you live close to the border, or heck, you work at the border like I used to, be mindful of your eyes and ears, and don't go chasing ghosts in the dark, especially alone. Border Patrol Ghost Story from A Line at a Time. It was another long night shift at the border. I remember sitting in the state-issued SUV with two other officers. I'll call them Jim and Terry. We were parked on a remote stretch of the border, miles from the nearest town, watching and waiting, which is what we do most nights, sitting for hours, scanning the darkness with night vision goggles, looking for any signs of movement. Jim and Terry were good guys, easy to work with. Jim was about my age, mid-30s, with a wife and 2 young kids at home. Terry was an older dude, in his late 50s. He'd been on the job longer than Jim and I combined. We often passed the time on these long nights by swapping stories. It was the typical stuff most of the time. Funny arrests, crazy chases, bureaucratic nonsense. But on that night, Terry was quiet. He seemed lost in thought. He was just staring out into the dark. "You all right there, Terry?" Jim asked, noticing the man's silence. Terry snapped to attention. He looked at me and then to Jim, like he was about to say something. "You boys ever hear any strange stories about this stretch of the border?" he asked, his voice serious. Jim and I exchanged a look. We had heard the usual rumors and urban legends that circulate among Border Patrol agents. Tales of drug runners and human traffickers and the occasional ghost story. But something in Terry's tone suggested this was different. "What kind of stories do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. Terry was quiet for a moment. Then with a heavy sigh, he started to speak. "This was about 20 years ago when I was a rookie agent. I was paired up with this older officer, Garcia. Tough as nails he was, didn't say much. He'd been on the job for decades, I think, had seen it all. We were out on patrol one night, not far from here. It was a night just like this. Quiet, dark, not a soul around. We had been sitting for hours and I was starting to nod off. And that's when Garcia suddenly sat up straight, grabbing his goggles. "You see that?" he asked me, his voice all tense. I looked where he was pointing, but I didn't see anything. It was just empty desert. But Garcia insisted. He said he saw a figure, a man walking out there in the dark. He got out of the SUV, began to walk out into the desert. I called after him, but he ignored me and kept going. So I had no choice but to follow him. We walked together for maybe 10 minutes, but Garcia was always a few steps ahead of me. I kept asking him what he saw, but he just wouldn't answer. And then, all of a sudden, he stopped. Dead still, like he'd hit an invisible wall. I caught up to him, and that's when I saw it too. About 50 yards ahead of us, there was a man. At least I think it was a man. It was hard to tell. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked to be an old-fashioned suit, like something out of the 1800s. And he just stood there, in the middle of the desert, not moving. I began to call out to him, but Garcia grabbed me by the arm. His grip was like iron. "Don't," he said. And there was real fear in that voice. I'd never heard him sound like that before. Then the figure started to move. And I'm not saying he walked. He glided across the ground. And he was coming straight for us. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Every instinct in me was telling me to run. But I was frozen. The figure got closer and closer, and I could see its face now. Decrepit. Old. Older than any man should be. Garcia was the first to move, and when he finally unfroze, that thing was only a few feet away from us. He yanked me by the arm hard, pulling me back the way we came. We ran, stumbling through the dark, not looking back. We didn't stop until we made it back to the SUV. Garcia was shaking as he started the engine. I remember that part. We didn't speak the whole drive back to the station, but just before we got out of the SUV, Garcia turned to me. "You didn't see anything out here tonight," he said. It wasn't a question, it was an order. "We didn't see anything. Understand?" I nodded, too shaken to argue, and that was the last we ever spoke of it. Garcia retired a year later. Unrelated, I think. just health issues, but it did make me wonder. I tried to put it out of my mind, convincing myself it was a trick of the light, maybe even fatigue or tiredness, but I never quite could. Not fully. And over the years, I've heard other stories too. Other agents having similar experiences out here, always at night, always the same stretch of desert. They say it's a ghost, the spirit of some poor soul who died out here a long time back. Maybe a migrant, maybe a settler, who knows, but something keeps it here, making it wander these sands. And sometimes, just sometimes when the night is dark and the desert is quiet, it appears to the unlucky few who happen to cross it. Terry fell silent, his story finished. Jim and I sat there, not quite knowing what to say about it. The desert outside the vehicle suddenly seemed a lot darker, a lot more threatening. "Terry, are you just trying to freak us out? Did you really see something like that?" Jim asked. Terry just nodded. "As clear as I see you now, and I pray every night I never see it again." We didn't talk much after that. Each of us were lost in our own thoughts, just staring out into the night with a new sense of fear, thanks to Terry. I've been on countless patrols since that night, but every time I'm out there in this particular stretch of border, I can't help but think about Terry's story. I do find myself looking out into the dark a little more intently, my heart beating a little faster when I do see some shadows or hear an unexpected sound. I can't help but think about Terry's story. A part of me hopes I never will, but there is another part of me that wonders how true his story was and how many of the other agents have similar tales. Out here after dark in the desert, feels like anything could happen at any time. What happens along Canada? From Cooper Trooper. The life of a Border Patrol agent can be pretty lonely, especially when you're stationed along the US-Canadian border. The job requires you to be alert, patient, and okay with being alone for long whiles. But even for those of us who are used to the long stretches of quiet, there are moments that really shake us up, the kind of stuff that makes you question what's real and what's not. You can call me Alex, and as you could probably guess by now, I work as a Border Patrol agent. I'm stationed at a rather remote outpost in the dense forests of northern Minnesota, right next to the Canadian border. It's a beautiful location, with tall pines, clear lakes, and lots of wildlife. But it's also a place where the line between natural and supernatural apparently can get pretty blurry, and this story will tell you why I think that. Before this, I've always been skeptical about paranormal stuff. I've heard a story here and there from some of the other guys about strange lights in the sky or weird noises at night. Heck, I've even heard of Sasquatch sightings up here. But I always thought they were just people's imaginations running wild in the dark. Anyway, this happened October 13th of 2023. It was a crisp autumn evening. I was halfway through my usual 12-hour shift. That night was moonless if I recall correctly. The stars were hidden by thick clouds anyway. I was driving along a lonely stretch of road, headlights cutting through the darkness as I looked for signs of activity along the tree line. To pass the time, I would occasionally chat with my friend Tom over the radio, who was hardly at work back at the station. He was about 20 miles east of me. We would often swap stories to keep each other awake during the long, boring hours. "Yo, Alex, did you hear about that strange light they spotted near Eli last week?" His voice crackled over the radio. I laughed. "Hey, Tom, let me guess. A UFO sighting?" "Maybe, but no. This one was a bit different. From what I heard, it was a huge pulsing ball of light that just hovered over the trees for a few minutes before disappearing. They say some hikers got it on video, but I haven't seen it yet." Sounds like a weather balloon to me, I said. There's my old skepticism kicking in. Yeah, probably, Tom agreed, but I don't think he sounded totally convinced. We were quiet for a while after that. Each of us focused on our own tasks. I kind of felt guilty, thinking maybe I was a buzzkill with my instant explanation to the supposed paranormal phenomenon. That night seemed to drag on forever. After Tom went quiet, I quickly became bored. I remember just thinking about plans for the next week when something happened. It started with a low, throbbing hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. At first, I thought it was my vehicle's engine acting up, but as the sound grew louder and more intense, I realized it was coming from somewhere else. I slowed to a stop, my heart racing as I scanned the trees for any movement. But the humming was getting louder now, and I didn't see any source. At that point, I could feel it vibrating in my bones, making my teeth chatter. And then, in an instant, the night exploded into blinding, searing light. It was like someone had flipped a switch, turning the dark night into a harsh, unforgiving whiteness that seemed to burn right through my eyes. I even threw my arm up to shield my face, squinting against the glare. My mind was racing, trying to explain what was happening. The light was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, a pulsing, throbbing brilliance. But it didn't seem to have a source. Let me just drill this home. It was the middle of the night and bright as the midday sun. Weirder yet, it didn't cast any shadows. The trees, the road, even the sky itself seemed to have been bleached of all their color, turned into a flat, featureless void. I then fumbled for the radio, my hands shaking as I tried to reach Tom. "Hey Tom, do you copy? Are you seeing this?" But my voice seemed small and far away, drowned out by the constant thrum of the light. I didn't get a response. There was only hissing static that seemed to get louder with each passing second. I felt a panic in my chest. I was then reminded I was completely alone, and the calm night had suddenly gone crazy. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. It just flicked right off. I was plunged instantly back into darkness. The sudden absence of the light left me temporarily blinded. I blinked rapidly, and eventually my eyes adjusted again. I sat there so confused. What in the world just happened? The humming was gone too, replaced by a very complete silence, which was almost deafening. Besides that, the night had returned to its natural state. The stars were visible again through the gaps in the clouds. But something was different. I could tell, and I don't think it was my remaining panic or paranoia. The air felt electric, as if that phenomenon had affected the very air around me. As I sat there, I tried to calm my racing heart, but I couldn't shake the feeling I had just witnessed something truly incredible, something that I still could not explain. Still shaking, I reached for the radio, and I tried Tom again. "Tom, are you there? Did you see that?" Still no response. More crackling static, and just my own heavy breathing. So I sat still for a while, trying to make sense of it and wondering what in the world I should do next. But then I began to hear something else. This was a deep, low rumble, like if the earth itself had become a sleeping beast. It was coming from the depths of the forest. It seemed to vibrate everything around me and everything in me. My teeth, my spine, my brain. For a moment, I hesitated. I wanted to kick it into gear and drive away, get away from that place. But also, I wanted to investigate. I was Border Patrol, and it was my job to confront any potential threats, no matter how strange or unexpected. But something about that sound filled me with a sense of dread. I was scared, and I couldn't quite explain it. Still, I knew I couldn't just sit there. I had to make a choice. One more time I reached for the radio, the shake in my voice increasing. "Dispatch, this is Alex. I'm hearing a strange noise coming from the woods, but a mile north of my current location. I'm gonna go check it out. Might need backup." Of course, no response. I then stepped out of my vehicle, my hand resting on my gun just in case. The night was very cold, very damp. The smell of pine and earth was very thick. I clicked on my flashlight. Step by step, I made my way into the forest, the rumbling sound growing louder and louder each passing moment. But I could tell it was coming from somewhere up ahead, deep within that tangled maze of trees and undergrowth that I could see. As I walked, I noticed something else, a pulsating light. Something in the distance was flickering, like a strobe. It was this sickly greenish-yellow color. The closer I got, the more intense it became, until it seemed to fill the entire forest with an eerie glow. And then a smell hit me. A sharp, acrid odor, like sulfur mixed with something else, something rotten and decaying. It filled my nose and mouth, making me gag and cough. I had to pull my shirt up over my nose, trying to block it out, but it seemed to seep into my pores, clinging to my skin. This morbid curiosity kept me going. The rumbling was deafening now, the light blinding. I was just about to break through the tree line, into what appeared to be a clearing where the light might be coming from, when it happened. There was a sudden, searing pain exploding in my head, like a white-hot knife being driven right into my skull. I remember clearly screaming at the top of my lungs and falling to my knees in agony. I kid you not, this was the worst pain I've ever felt. Like, imagine your brain being ripped apart from the inside. But then, I just remember waking up. I had apparently passed out. But when I came to, I was by my vehicle again. How I'd gotten there, unconsciously, I have no idea. My vision was a bit blurry as I tried to get up. The rumbling sound had stopped. There was no more pulsating light. Everything was silent, except for the distant hooting of an owl. My headache was completely gone, too. I looked around. When I first saw that I was next to my vehicle, my blood ran cold. I could hear from the ground outside. The radio was going crazy, a jumble of voices and static blaring from my speakers.
"Alex, do you copy? What's your status? Need backup at the northern perimeter. Strange lights reported in."
I staggered to my feet. How did I get here? I thought. What even happened in the woods? I then felt something warm and sticky on my upper lip. I reached up, and my fingers touched it. When I pulled them away, I saw that they were covered with blood. Blood that had poured from my nose all over my uniform. I fumbled for my phone, intending to call for help, but when I pulled it out of my pocket, I was even more confused and shocked. The screen was flashing. My phone was factory resetting itself. All my data, my contacts, my photos, everything had been gone. Who did that? How did that happen? Am I crazy? Have any of you ever had your phone just factory reset out of nowhere? I stood there just so freaked out. I didn't know what to do. In the end, I did the only thing I could do. I stumbled back into the vehicle, my hands trembling, and I took a deep breath. I tried to calm myself, and I pulled away, driving back to the nearest station, where I made a report of what I saw and got medical care. Luckily, X-rays and CT scans didn't find anything wrong with me. Tom believed my story, but I can't say the same about my other coworkers. I did take a day off, so that was nice, but it was hard to enjoy after experiencing something like that. So, in the end, what do you think it was? Some sort of weird UFO event? Maybe an asteroid or meteor with some sort of EMF that was strong enough to mess up my brain and my phone? And what? Did it get up and carry me back to my vehicle? I don't know. I just don't know. Old Dogman Tales from West Goodland. Let me tell you some stories from back in my days with the CBSA, the Canada Border Services Agency. I personally spent most of my career either behind a desk, going through reports, or patrolling the forests along the border, keeping an eye out for drug mules and whatnot. It was a pretty quiet job most of the time, but every now and then, you would hear some stories that might make your skin crawl. This set of stories in particular regards a certain type of that my coworkers cited on multiple occasions. I remember one time sitting around the office with some of the other agents. We were shooting the breeze near the end of the day. One of the older guys, named Lewis, starts telling us about this weird thing he saw out in the woods. He said he'd been hearing stories about this creature for years, but he never really believed them. Not until he saw it himself. Here's how it went down according to him. Lewis was out on patrol in his vehicle one night, driving along a road that runs parallel to the border for several miles. It was pretty late, and he wasn't expecting to see anyone out there. But then, up ahead, he spots this van parked on the side of the road. He drives by it real slow, takes a look at it. He can see the tops of a couple of heads. Looks like a couple of folks either hiding or sleeping. Lewis wasn't sure if he wanted to investigate this. If it was just some people sleeping, it was a pretty common sight, especially for those who got lost on the road, mainly tourists and such. About 50 yards away from the van, he stops, pulls over, and decides he should check it out, just to be safe. He walks down to the van, enjoying the walk because he said the breeze felt nice. As he walks up to the driver's side window, he gets a better look at the inside. There is a couple in there, but they're not hiding. They both seem to be sleeping. Even so, he taps on the window. The guy inside wakes up startled. The man shifts around to get up, waking up the woman he's with. The guy rolls down the window, and Lewis asks, "Border Service, everything all right here?" The guy starts to explain they've been driving for hours, and they were just too tired to keep going. Apparently, they were from Michigan, on a little romantic road trip, but they were having trouble reading their map. They didn't know where the nearest gas station actually was, nor any motels. So they figured they would just pull over and catch a few winks. Now, Lewis is a pretty understanding guy. He tells them that's no problem, but they shouldn't be parking out here like this. He begins to explain some directions for them to the nearest town, when all of a sudden, he hears this loud snap behind him. The couple in the van look right past him, eyes wide and freaked out, so Lewis spins around to take a look. There on the other side of the road, he sees this thing standing there. At first, he thinks it's a bear or something, but then he realizes it's standing on two legs, and it's much leaner than a bear, and it's tall, like really tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet at least. The thing is just standing there perfectly still, like it's watching them. But Lewis can see it breathing. Lewis says at that point his heart was beating like it never had before. He was trying to figure out what the heck he was even looking at. He can see it was covered in fur, but it was not like any animal he'd ever seen. It had these yellow eyes, and Lewis swears the thing was just boring into his soul with the way it was staring. Lewis just stood there, and the couple kept staring. Nobody moved, nobody said a word. Then, as quickly as they saw it, the thing turns and bounds off into the forest. Lewis says at this part of the story, he had never seen a living creature move that fast in his life. It was like it was there 1 second and gone the next, in these huge strides. As you could probably guess, Lewis was really shaken up by then. The couple in the van could tell, and when Lewis turns around to face them again, The guy asks if he'd like a ride back to his vehicle before they head off. Now, it was only 50 yards or so, but Lewis was not too keen on walking back there alone after seeing that. So he takes them up on their offer, even though it's probably against some protocol, and he hops in the van. They drive him back to his vehicle. Lewis thanks them for the help, giving them a quick refresher about his directions, and they part ways. Lewis gets in his car and drives back to the office. When Lewis told us this story the first time, we were all pretty skeptical. I mean, a giant furry creature walking on 2 legs. Sounds like a scary movie. But then a few of the other guys started to chime in, saying that they've heard similar stories over the years. That was the day that I realized this thing had been spotted all over the forests here, always at night too. Some folks called it a dogman, saying it was similar to the thing people claim to see in Michigan, in the US. Others say it's a wendigo. But really, nobody knew for sure what it was. All I knew was, after hearing Lewis's story, I started to pay more attention when I was out on patrol. I'd be lying to you if I said I didn't get a little jumpy every time I heard a twig snap or saw a shadow move in the trees. But that was part of my job, I guess. When you spend as much time in the woods as we did, you're bound to see some strange things out there, or at least hear them. And from the sounds of it, sounds like there's nothing quite as strange as coming face to face with a creature that's not meant to exist. That's just one of my stories from my time with the CBSA, one of the ones that stuck with me, probably because it was the first time I really began to believe that maybe there was something out there, something that we can't explain. Fast forward a few years from that, I was sitting in the break room with some of the newer recruits. We were swapping stories about the weird things we've seen out in the woods. One of the guys, not one of the new ones, Gene, starts telling us about this encounter he had only a few months ago. Gene was out on patrol one night. He gets a call about some underage kids who got caught trying to smuggle cases of booze across the border. He catches up to them, pulls them over, and sure enough, the car is full of beer and liquor, and they were years away from being legal. So he loads the kids into the back of his cruiser. He starts to head back to the station. He's giving them the usual lecture about how this is going to go on their permanent record and how they're lucky they didn't get caught by the American side, which is said to be much harsher. Then, all of a sudden, the kids start to scream bloody murder from the back seat. Gene, who had been glancing on and off at the rearview mirror as he talked, slammed on the brakes, startled. He looks up just in time to see this massive, hairy figure taking a step off the road and into the trees. He says it had to be about 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It was walking on 2 legs, like a person. For a second, Gene just sits there, wondering what in the world he just saw. He could hear the kids in the back, cursing, freaked out, and also excited, saying things like, "Dude, no way that was real." Gene couldn't agree with the kid, because he knew what he just saw, and he was beyond scared. Gene was just about to pull away when the back end of his cruiser suddenly dipped down. It was like something heavy just sat on the trunk. The kids start to scream again. Gene whips around to take a look at what's going on. There, pressed up against the back window, are these 2 glowing yellow eyes staring right at them. Gene says the thing had the snout of a dog, but it was far too big to be any kind of dog he'd ever seen. It had pointed ears like a wolf or something. But the really scary part was that it wasn't alone. As Gene's just sitting there, frozen in fear, he sees another set of eyes, just behind the first one. There were 2 of these things behind his car. Whatever they were both just looking at them, as if curious, or maybe wanting to get inside. He says he didn't know what to do. I don't think anyone knows what to do in that situation. He was armed, of course, but he wasn't about to start shooting at these things from the inside of the vehicle. Not with the kids in the back. So he did the only thing he could think to do. He floored it. Says he must have went about 100 miles an hour, tearing down that dark, empty road, the idea of those things chasing after him in his head, though he doubts they actually were. The kids were screaming, not really sure if they were thrilled or terrified at his driving. He was really just praying that he could make it back to the station and not have to see anything else like that for the remainder of the night. Eventually, he sees the lights of the station up ahead. He pulls into the parking lot, tires squealing, and jumps out of the car, quickly getting those teenagers out and into the building. As he looked back right before going inside, he saw that the road was empty and the woods were quiet, as they should be. Gene says he didn't tell anyone what happened at first. He was way too creeped out and confused. A couple years later, he heard another story from a different agent, a similar one, and he decided to finally share his. It really helps you open up when you realize you may not be as crazy as you once thought. When Gene shared that story, the whole break room went quiet, but then more people began to open up. The more we talked, the more stories began to come out of the woodwork. Not every agent saw something like this, but they did have eerie things that they couldn't explain happen. For example, some of those guys claimed they'd seen things running alongside their cars, keeping pace at high speeds. Others said they'd found weird footprints in the snow, tracks that looked about 2 to 3 times bigger than a wolf's. Then there were the really wild stories. The ones that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Well, either that, or made you laugh. Those were the ones I have trouble believing. Like the one from the agent who swore he saw these things rip a deer apart with their bare claws. Or the guy who claimed he'd been chased through the woods by a whole pack of them. Now, I definitely don't believe every one of these stories, especially the crazier ones like those. After all, there are some guys who just want to be a part of the crowd. But I'm not the end-all be-all of the truth. For all I know, all those stories were true in some way. This brings me to one more story that I've got for you. This one might be the creepiest of them all. It happened to a friend of mine, an agent who was working at one of those remote border stations, the kind that's miles away from anywhere and only staffed by a handful of people. It was late one night when my friend, Cheyenne, was working the graveyard shift with just one other lady. They were both sitting in the office just catching up on paperwork, trying to stay awake too, downing way too much coffee, as you do on those kinds of nights. That's when Cheyenne begins to hear these strange noises coming from outside. At first, she thinks it's the wind, maybe a raccoon or something. But as she listens closer, she realizes it sounds more like sniffing, like something is literally pressing its nose up against the walls of the building outside, taking deep breaths. She tries to ignore it and focus on her work, but the noises are getting louder and more persistent. After about 20 minutes of this, they stop altogether. She breathes a sigh of relief, then goes back to her paperwork, figuring whatever it was must have lost interest and wandered off. But then, about half an hour later, all hell breaks loose. Out of nowhere, this blood-curdling howl erupts from just outside the building. It was so loud somehow, so close, it makes the windows rattle. Cheyenne jumps out of her chair, covers her ears, and looks over at her coworker, who was white as a sheet. And then, before either of them could say a word, 2 more howls answered the first, coming from the opposite side of the office. It was like they were surrounded, like whatever was out there had them completely boxed in. Cheyenne's mind was racing, trying her best to figure out what in the world was making those sounds. She knew that there were wolves in the area, but this was something different. It sounded bigger, stronger than any wolf she had heard. And that's when things got really weird. she began to hear this scratching sound like claws on metal coming from the wall behind her desk. She turned around slowly, her eyes wide with fear. Because here's the thing. These clawing sounds were coming about 8 feet off the ground, way higher than any normal animal around these parts could reach. Sure, it could be a bear, but bears don't howl. For the next 20 minutes or so, Cheyenne and her coworkers sat there in terror, listening to the scratching, the sniffing, the howls, wondering what in God's name was out there with them and what they wanted. After what felt like forever, the noises began to fade away. She guessed whatever it was had finally given up and moved on. She and her coworkers sat there for a while, wordlessly. They were seriously too scared to move. She says it felt like if she moved or made too much noise, those things might come back. Think about that. Has anything scared you enough to instill prey-like thoughts in your head? When the next shift arrived, she went out to take a look. There were these deep claw marks gouged into the walls of the building on the outside. Marks that no coyote or wolf could have made. They were a bit too deep, too broad, too high up off the ground. The clincher, though. Cheyenne swears she could even smell the things that had been out there. There was this heavy, musky odor, a sort of stench she had never encountered around these parts before. And there you have it, the best 3 stories I've heard about the dog man cited by the CBSA. It's just so crazy that I feel like I'm just scratching the surface here about all the weird and unexplainable things that some of the agents have seen along the Canadian border. As for those dog man creatures, I wonder what they are. Mutated wolves? The missing link? Could be something even weirder, like some sort of furry alien. Truth is, I've got no idea. But after 30 years on the job, I've learned to keep an open mind. And at this point, I think I do believe that there's some sort of werewolf dogman type thing out there. Or at least something that looks like one. But hey, that's just one old agent's opinion. Take it for what it's worth. The Immigrant's Story. From Stuff Joseph Says. It was a scorching hot day out in the desert. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and dance like it's alive. I was doing my routes along the border when I run up on what appears to be an illegal immigrant with an injured leg. He's limping his way along and frowns when he sees me. He's in rough shape, his leg all twisted at a weird angle, his face pale with pain too. Looks like he had come a long way. I radio for help, and I carefully pull over and make my way out to him. The gravel there was pretty loose, and I try not to lose my footing. I ask him some questions. He was luckily bilingual, and admits he had crossed the border, stating that he's a Mexican citizen. I asked him where he thought he was going, and he said that he had some family out in New Mexico. He didn't have any papers, but I wasn't too worried about that just yet. Illegal or not, this guy needed some medical attention, and part of my job was to make sure he got it. I help him, half carrying, half dragging him back to my vehicle. It was slow going, but eventually we made it. I got him settled in the back seat and propped his torn up leg on a blanket. I started the long drive back to the nearest Border Patrol station. M was quiet at first, likely disappointed and scared. When you cross the border illegally, and an agent finds you, guys like this are usually thinking when they're going to be sent back, and whether or not they're going to make that long journey again, just to be sent back once more. Now, in all honesty, that's not the case for everyone. These days, many of these folks are just let in and given court dates, and as long as they show back up for court, they're often able to stay here for long periods of time until they get citizenship. After a while, he starts to relax a bit. The two of us get to talking. I ask him about his family in New Mexico. He says that's all the family he has left. His wife had just passed away, and he had nothing to his name. He had some kids, but they died in childhood, sadly. We keep driving for several more minutes. Eventually, the conversation turns to how the journey was, how tough it might have been, the things he saw out there. Then I see him smile, and he begins to open up with a story. I've heard my fair share of weird stories over the years, but what M tells me next sends a chill down my spine and a smile across my face. It was both eerie and a bit wholesome. M said that a few nights back, he was trying to sleep out in the open, covered only by a tarp he'd brought with him. That's when a man suddenly appeared out of nowhere. The guy came right up and just sat down on a nearby rock. He was a gringo, M says, wearing old worn-out clothes with a big bushy beard. At first, the man just sat there, sipping at a dark brown bottle, which M assumed was alcohol. He sat up, eyeing the man warily, wondering what he wanted and how he had managed to sneak up on him like that. The gringo spoke. He asked him where he was going. His voice was low and gravelly. M hesitated for a moment, not sure if he should answer at all. But something about the man's calm, steady gaze made him feel like he could trust him. "To my family," M said, "in New Mexico." The man smiled at him, then took another swig from his bottle. He cleared his throat, and when he started to speak again, he went straight away giving M directions. And M says the man's voice took on a strange, almost hypnotic quality. He told the immigrant exactly where to go, which paths to take, which ones to avoid. Then, almost as an afterthought, he warned M about the pit, a deep and treacherous drop-off in the ground that he needed to steer clear of at all costs. M listened carefully, committing the man's words to memory. And just as suddenly as he'd appeared, the man stood up, walked off into the distance, and as his figure grew smaller and smaller, M blinked and he vanished. M really focused on this part, describing that the man didn't just fade away in the distance. Rather, his figure was gone in the blink of an eye, and yet there was nothing nearby the man for him to hide behind to disappear like that. There was just no sign of him anymore. This weirded him out, but he went back to sleep, needing the energy for the rest of the journey. Come morning, he packed up his tarp and his water and set out again, following the directions the man had given him, because otherwise he really had nothing to go on. Then the strangeness of the night turned into a miracle, because the path the man gave him led him straight to a gap in the border fence, a narrow opening that he never would have found on his own. M squeezed through, more excited than ever. He started to make his way across the desert on the other side. But then, just as he was starting to think he might actually make it, he hit a patch of loose gravel and lost his footing. He tumbled down into a ditch, his leg twisting underneath him with a sickening crunch. M explains he was actually lucky. It could have been much worse. I glanced back at him and asked how. Well, supposedly, just a few feet away from where he'd fallen, there was a steep, jagged drop-off, so deep and sudden, he never would have seen it coming. If he had taken just a few more steps over, he would have gone tumbling over that edge, and that would have been the end of him. As I listened to his story, I got goosebumps. I'd heard plenty of strange stories over the years, yeah, but this was different. It was like the man had known what was going to happen, like he'd been looking out for M somehow. Makes me wonder, who was that guy? Just some random gringo, out wandering the desert for kicks? Or was he something more than that? I emptied my thoughts and just focused on driving back to the station. M got the medical attention he needed. And as far as I know after that, M actually made it to his family in New Mexico, and he's well on his way to citizenship. All of this just goes to show you, the desert is one weird place. Thanks for tuning in to Tales from the Break Room, the home of the scariest true work stories. If you want to hear your story narrated by me, send it to me at eeriecast.com/submit. We pay 5 cents per word for accepted stories. Help us grow by leaving Tales from the Break Room a rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app. Check out eeriecast.com or search for EerieCast on those very same podcast apps to see our other exciting and terrifying podcasts, like Unexplained Encounters, the other show I host, where I read stories with a focus on the supernatural. To get some merch, go to eeriecast.store. And to unlock ad-free episodes of your favorite EerieCast shows and exclusive audiobooks, go to eeriecast.com/plus and consider signing up for EerieCast Plus. You can follow me on Twitter, I guess it's X now, @DarkPrevails. You can also subscribe to me on YouTube, where I deliver the same content. Just look for Darkness Prevails. Good night. I hope we can share another break sometime soon. Send your scariest workplace stories to us at eeriecast.com/submit and rate and review Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks. Get ready for deadly prison ghosts and tragic, horrifying deaths in today's stories. My friend Lady Spookeria joins us for a nice little break today. She had to stop by to pick up some coffee beans, but I told her if she didn't narrate a few stories for us today while she was here, then I was going to replace one random coffee bean with a rat turd, and I wouldn't tell her which one. If you like her narration, please subscribe to her YouTube channel, Lady Spookeria, on YouTube. I'll leave a link in the description. These are Tales from the Break Room. The Disappearing Visitor, from Johan 25. I am a nurse working at a hospital. The hospital in particular is fairly large. And as a rule of thumb, the larger the hospital, the more deaths occur there. At least, that's what it seems like. I was, like many other young nurses at the time, working the night shift. I will also note I used to be a skeptic, like the majority of folks. But after spending some time in a long-term care facility prior to this event, I started believing in hauntings and spirits. I spent a number of nights seeing darting shadows out of the corner of my eye, hearing strange noises. Not to mention some of the things the residents of the facility told me they saw. But those are different stories. So by the time I was working in that certain hospital, I was already a fairly firm believer in spirits and such. The night this occurred was just like any other. I did my first couple of rounds on my patients, then passed out their medications. By the time I finished with these tasks, it was around 12 or 12:30 in the morning. I decided to go down to our cafeteria to get something to eat before they closed up for the night. Everything went perfectly fine until I had my food. I was heading back up to the break room to eat it. I was walking down the hall behind a fairly young woman, who I assumed to be a visitor of one of the many patients of the facility. Mind you, this was prior to the COVID thing, so visitors were allowed at any hours throughout the night. This lady looked perfectly normal, like you or me. No ghastly features, no see-through body. None of the stuff that you might be expecting. I still remember to this day what she looked like, what she was wearing. She had long, straight hair that was about halfway down her back. She had a blue, soft-looking, almost handmade jacket, and a solid black skirt that went all the way down to her ankles. I naively believed she was just another normal person, but I very quickly found out I was very wrong. As we walked down the hallway, she arrived at the elevator before me. She pressed the call button on the wall to go up to another floor. I quickly walked to try to catch up to her, as to not have to wait on the elevator again. I saw her walk onto the elevator, but as soon as I was in front of the door, she was completely gone. She had vanished. No one was inside the elevator any longer. It was like she did not exist at all, leaving no trace whatsoever, with an open elevator door in front of me, just inviting me in. I didn't feel very comfortable getting on the elevator after that, so I opted to walk around to the other side of the hospital to use a completely different set of elevators. To this day, that is the clearest spirit or apparition I've ever seen. And even though I was not injured by any means, it still makes me glad not to have to work on the night shift anymore. She was asking for help. From Lambanog Girl. This happened back in 2004, at the very first company I ever worked at. The story begins one day when I was on my way to work. Usually I took the office bus, which was provided for us at a certain pickup point, because it was free. That day when we passed by a road that didn't have any structures or people along it, only tall grass, a vacant lot that had been abandoned, there was this nasty smell, and I mean it was rotten, like they had dumped a lot of food and just left it to rot. And I was not the only one who noticed. The other passengers with me noticed it too, because they were covering their noses. When I got to the office, it was the topic of the day. Everyone was talking about this nasty smell on the road. Every day before this, we passed by that road to the office, but only this time had it smelled so rotten. For the next couple of days, the smell started to smell more like a dead rat than rotten food. The city maintenance group was trying to search for where the smell was coming from. But unfortunately, after nearly a week, they still could not find the source. I even joked with my coworkers that the smell was starting to smell like a dead person. They stared at me with fear. One day, we were passing by the smelly road. I was leaning my head on the window when somebody slammed on the glass. I was startled and looked right up, only to see the face of a woman, a bloody face, and yet the bus was still moving. That made my heart nearly stop, but I kid you not, when I blinked, she was gone. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself I'd fallen asleep and had a very vivid and spooky dream. I was very tired that day. When I got home, I was too sleepy, and the moment I lay down on my bed, I went right to sleep. However, sleep paralysis took over me. As a note, sleep paralysis had been normal for me since I was about 10 years old. Anyway, during this particular episode, I made the mistake of trying to open my eyes, and it worked. I was taught that if you fall into sleep paralysis, the first thing you should do is try to move your fingers and toes. But instead, I opened my eyes, and I saw her. My bedroom door opened, and I saw her crawl inside, like Sadako crawling out from the TV. And I was thinking, oh God, have I been watching too many Asian horror films? She continued to crawl towards me. I was trying to calm myself, trying to move my fingers and toes now. You see, if I'm in sleep paralysis once I opened my eyes, I cannot get myself to close them back. The only option I had was to do everything I could to wake myself up. As she continued to crawl, she reached my bedside and turned her head towards me. There it was, the very same bloody face that had banged on my window on the bus. I then woke up. I nearly screamed. I felt chills all over my body. The day after that, the smell was gone from that road. When I got to the office, people were talking about the reason for the smell. Apparently, someone had chopped up a woman and shoved her remains into one of the drainage pipes along that road. When my coworker verified it, showing me the news article, it had the photo of the woman. It was the very same face of the bloody-faced woman who had followed me home.
The Judgment Chair Shaker Ghost, from Logic Eraser. I work in a factory located on top of a hill. When I was working the night shift at my workplace, I would always use the meeting rooms during breaks to get some shut-eye. My colleagues, being smokers, were all having the time of their lives in the smoking corner far away, so I was usually the only one left in the building. On numerous occasions, an office chair would start shaking back and forth. After a few nights, I noticed a pattern to it. If I ate biscuits and dropped some crumbs on the floor, the chair would shake. If I dropped trash on the ground, the chair would shake. If I put my 2 feet on the table or on another chair, the chair would shake. One day when the chair started shaking, for the heck of it, I asked the room a question. Is there a ghost here? Shake the chair once for yes. Shake the chair twice for no. Immediately after I said that, the shaking pattern of the chair changed. It shook once then stopped. I asked if I should put my feet on the ground. The chair shook once. I then asked if I should put my feet up on the chair. The chair now shook twice. After that, I began asking it a few questions. When I asked if I should leave this room, there was a pause before it shook once. When I asked if I could stay in the room, it shook once too. When I asked if it was haunting this location, the answer was yes. After some time, the ghost was sick of my questions and stopped replying to any of my questions. Ever since that night, every time I entered the meeting room, I would say something like, "Pardon my intrusion," or that I would only be here for a short while. I shared my experience with others in my workplace, and they too said it was a chair that shook for no reason. However, I was the first person to talk to the chair. Unfortunately, this chair-shaking ghost was not the only ghost haunting this location. There are at least 2 other spiritual entities I encountered. These other ghosts were not as friendly as the chair-shaker ghost, but they rarely make their presence known.
She saved her children from no more. This took place almost 40 years ago. On early, crisp, cool, and quiet spring mornings, the memory comes back to me as if it had just happened moments ago. I worked at a daycare center as a daycare teacher. My schedule was the opening shift, where myself and the cook for the daycare would be the only employees present from 5:45 a.m. until 7 a.m. Our daycare opened at 6. We went about our routine of me preparing the main room for the morning arrival of children, while the cook was preparing breakfast. At 6:05, our first 2 children of the day arrived at their regular time. Now, our cook was an excellent cook. I'll refer to her as Chef Brenda. The daycare was filled with the delicious scent of bacon being fried and blueberry muffins being baked. The 2 children, aged 3 and 5, were sitting with me at the dining table, playing with a children's puzzle while waiting for breakfast. It was a routine, normal, peaceful morning. Then, at 6:15 a.m., I heard screaming and shouting close to the front door. I quickly rose from the table to look out the window, which faced the front yard, to see what was going on. But before I could reach the window, the door beside it burst open, and a crying woman came running in, holding a small baby in her arms, and holding the hand of a child who looked about 2 years old. She quickly handed both children to me, then turned back towards the door, running, telling me to lock it and call the police. I stood there, dumbfounded, shocked, for a split second. I then ran to the door and locked it, still holding the baby. The cook had come out of the kitchen when she heard the frantic woman saying to lock the door. So Brenda took the toddler and had him sit at the table with the other 2 children. Moments after locking the door, I heard a man outside yelling, cussing, and a woman screaming. I looked out the window and I saw a man holding a knife in one hand, and the woman, the one who had just run into the daycare, he grabbed her by the hair with his other hand. He had her face to face with him as he pulled her head back. She was screaming and crying, begging him to stop. They were only about 6 feet away from the daycare. I ran to the director's office to call the police. Brenda gathered all the children and took them into a classroom in the back of the building. She put on a VHS sing-along tape to distract the children and to drown out the sound of what was going on outside. I was a terrified, nervous wreck. I was worried about the woman and the parents and children who would arrive at the daycare shortly at about 6:30 a.m. Would they walk right into this dangerous situation? I was soon on the phone with the police dispatcher when I heard a gurgled, sharp scream, which had to have come from the woman outside. I then heard the man yelling,
"Open the door! Give me my kids!"
Then I heard glass break. I peeked out of the office door, which was only a few feet away from the entrance. The entrance door had a small rectangular-shaped window, and the man had broken it. He was now trying to reach the handle to unlock the door from the inside. Thank goodness he could not reach the latch. I let the dispatcher know what he had done, and she informed me that the police were coming on the scene right now. 30 seconds later, I heard it.
"Drop the knife!"
Then I heard officers arresting the man. An officer soon asked, through the broken window, how many people were inside. I told him 2 adults and 4 small children. He told us to stay put, and that an officer would come in soon and talk to us. With all of this going on, I hadn't realized that the breakfast had burned. I rushed to the kitchen to turn everything off. I then called the daycare director and I told her about what happened. After I hung up, I went to the cabinet. I grabbed a box of graham crackers and apple juice, as well as some cups. I took them to the back classroom to give the children something to eat. The infant that the woman brought in looked to be about 3 months old and was now sleeping in Brenda's arms. The toddler looked to be about 2. They were both wearing footy pajamas, looking like they were well loved and cared for at home. I heard loud knocking at the main door. I went to open it for the officers. 3 of them came into the daycare. 1 was a detective. The detective asked me if I was the one who called the police, and I said yes. He asked about what happened and requested that I describe the woman who ran in with the kids. I told him everything I witnessed. He then asked to see the woman's children. I went and got them from the back room. Afterwards, I took them back to Brenda and came back to the officers. I had a feeling in my gut, though, the entire time, that their mother was dead. It was the look on the faces of the policemen when they looked at her children. Eventually, the detective confirmed my fears. Their mother was dead, right in front of the daycare. He then asked if there was a back way out of the building. I told him about the back door leading to the fenced-in playground, and that I could unlock the fence. We tried to shield all the children from the scene as we left the daycare. The woman's body was still there where she died. We went into the police cars. The officers had me contact the parents of our 2 daycare children and have them picked up at a nearby store. That woman's children were going to be picked up by the Child Protection Agency until other family members were located. I found out through local news that the woman and man were husband and wife and had moved to the neighborhood where the daycare was located 2 weeks before. They lived 6 houses down from the daycare center. The husband had gotten high and drunk the previous night and began to beat the wife, threatening to kill her, their children, and then himself. She must have run to the daycare to save her babies and did everything she could to keep them safe by running back into danger to steer her husband away and give me time to lock the door. Her husband ended up dying in prison of natural causes 10 years later, after being convicted and sentenced to 20 years for murder. I quit my job a month after the murder. I was too scared, nervous, sad. I kept thinking about the mother being killed, hearing her killer trying to get into the daycare, seeing the blood on the walkway in front of the daycare where she had been killed, seeing the blood on the door from his arm being cut from the window when he tried to reach in. It took a week of scrubbing to get all the blood out, and the door had to be replaced. This new door had no window in it, but it still reminded me of that horrible day. I always wonder about her children. The last I heard about them was that their aunt, the mother's sister, had adopted them. Sinking feeling from Nightfly. I'd been a museum tour guide for the better part of 4 years. We had several exhibits pass through monthly. It was late October of 2022. We had just hosted our haunted exhibit. It included things like crime scene photos, bricks from a local insane asylum, murder weapons, haunted objects, mirrors with handprints and faces in them, and a newly loaned face familiar to many horror and ghost fans, Robert the doll. I myself did not believe in anything paranormal. In fact, I found it abhorrent how people easily bought into that. So I was the only tour guide willing to work on the Robert exhibit. He was just a creepy-looking old doll, dressed in a sailor suit, with oddly lifeless blank eyes. He was encased firmly in glass with pressure-sensitive devices, in case anyone got any bold ideas. I mean, he was a famous doll. He was open to viewing every Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and the weekends. So I often did the closing shift, staying mostly in that room. I had to warn people not to take pictures and to not ask beforehand, simply so we wouldn't be held liable and per one of the conditions of the doll being loaned to us for the month. Every time I would have to say, "Please ask before you take pictures of Robert. It has been claimed that he causes accidents and heart attacks." When I had to say that, I fought not to roll my eyes. How could one being, let alone a creepy old doll, cause accidents or deaths? It seemed very silly, and the look of fright in people's eyes seemed so unjustified. When there was nobody around, oftentimes I found myself openly staring at the doll, sometimes tossing challenges at him. "If you really haunted Robert, do something. I don't believe half the crap they say you can do." I would come into work sometimes to see him leaned against the glass, or his position adjusted, and I would figure it was a coworker messing with me. So I would disarm the sensors, fix him at least twice a week before I started the first shift of the day. It was getting closer to Halloween, and for profit, the museum hosted a seance with Robert as the star guest. Needless to say, everyone seemed to have a good time. I don't know if it was a setup, but I happened to be the one in the room that night. Knocks, things being thumped on, lights flickering, whispered voices, growls, and things moving were endless that night. We had dozens of participants, and they were all flabbergasted and swore to being still and silent. I didn't buy it. When everyone was focused solely on the doll and the responses, I walked around, checking for speakers, devices, looking closely at people's feet to see what was really going on. The director was there at the time and seemed really pale, so I had to guess that this had nothing to do with him. And I couldn't find any devices. I was rather puzzled and somewhat flustered. I was really starting to feel paranoid when I suddenly felt something playing with my hair. I was startled and quickly looked over to the doll. Robert was now leaned against the glass, staring right at me. I was shocked. Just a few moments ago, he was positioned away from me. He had been facing the seance table. I was ashamed to say that I left the room and went home immediately after, telling my boss that I just felt sick. On the way home, I narrowly avoided a truck barreling down the side road that ran into the main road, which I turned down to go home. If I hadn't slammed on the brakes in time, I would have been involved in a really bad crash. I went home shaken, and I put in for a vacation shortly after, determined to not have to see that doll ever again.
The trash can from Anonymous. This incident happened pretty recently, so I have to keep details to a minimum for security reasons. I just moved here and got a job as a housekeeper at a hospital. I wanted a fresh start and to move on from my bad past and abusive family. Everything was going great until this day. But anyway, I really liked the job, meeting the patients, cleaning their rooms, and getting to know them. I love it. So back to this day. I was cleaning the restrooms. I was in the men's restroom that is right next to the women's, and my stomach just felt sick. Something felt wrong, but I blew it off and kept cleaning, when all of a sudden, I see a woman with a backpack run into the women's bathroom, throw her backpack in the trash, and she ran off. I called after her, telling her she can't leave it here, but she just kept running. I went into the woman's bathroom and looked at the bag. It was wet on the bottom and had a weird smell. Me being dumb and not calling for security, I put my gloves on and opened the bag slowly. And boom, I saw a blue, purple newborn baby. In panic, I took my scrub shirt off, grabbed the baby out of the bag, and started doing soft compressions on their chest. I wrapped the baby in my shirt and ran to the nurse's station. Everything is a blur and still doesn't feel real. I went up to the nurse's station and calmly, in shock, I said, I need help, please, with tears running down my face, and the baby in my bra, not to mention. The nurses rushed over, asking me all sorts of questions. Where did I get this baby? When did I find the baby? I just stood there in shock, still rubbing the baby's chest and softly pushing. They grabbed the baby and started working on the baby. There was a huge swarm of people around me and the baby. Eventually, security showed up, asking me all sorts of questions, and said they have police coming to ask me questions. All I could think of was the baby, so I kept asking them if the baby was okay. That's when I heard the most beautiful sound. The baby started crying. I stood up and asked if I could see the baby, and they told me not yet, because they still need to check them out and make sure they are okay. I had police and my boss ask me questions, but I don't really remember them. Everything was a huge blur. Eventually, they told me the baby was okay, and they took her to the NICU. I remember I went back to my cart and started to mop the floor in the men's bathroom, and my boss grabbed me by my shoulders and told me to go home, and gave me another scrub shirt. I put it on and called my boyfriend. All I could say was, I really need you to pick me up as fast as you can. While I was waiting for him, I went outside and sat on the ground, just touching the grass, staring into nothing. He showed up, got out of the car, and was panicking because I was covered in blood and other stuff from the baby. I told him I was okay, kissed his cheek, went home, took a shower, and got a call from my boss checking in on me. He told me to take the week off, and that the police would be in contact with me for more questions. I know, this story sounds a lot like the teen mom and her mother that threw her baby in the trash at the hospital. I know, what a coincidence. I promise I'm not copying the story. This really happened, and I'm still really messed up about it in the head. I still get really nervous to go in the bathrooms or look into the trash cans. One of the nurses did give me an update on the baby. She told me the baby girl is fine, and she was lucky I found her. And she said I helped keep her heart pumping by my small rubs and compressions I did. I gave her a hug and thanked her for telling me, the world is a crazy but beautiful place. Stay safe out there, And keep your eye out for crazy people. Thank you for listening to my story. Have a good one.
Snowboarding accident. From Sonora. One day at work, me and a couple of coworkers were lounging lazily outside, smoking during a break. One of my younger coworkers told us this story that his dad told him, as it had happened in the last couple of years. He explained that his father did some type of work involving checking and diagnosing power lines for problems with electricity. At the time, he was working at a popular ski resort, just a little ways up the hill out of our small historic town. On the evening of the incident, one of these ski lifts was out of order, so he was called at near dark to go check and follow the power lines to find the problem. So he set out, equipped with a flashlight, to go check it out. After checking a couple of poles and following the lines, he sat down for a break before going on. Once his break was over, he switched on his flashlight so he could see through the falling snow and dark. In the snowbound silence, he made his way to the next pole, following the nearly invisible power lines against a black sky. As he approached the next pole, he noticed an odd shadow behind it, dancing in the swaying beam of his flashlight. At first, he really wasn't sure what it could possibly be. But as he got closer, he began to get a feeling of dread in the pit of his stomach. That feeling grew as he started to realize what he was looking at was a pair of legs, sticking straight up out of the snow at the base of the power pole. One leg was still attached to a snowboard, but the other leg was free of the board and bent at an angle. Nothing moved. There was only the stillness and silence of the snow slowly falling around him. He wondered for a few seconds what, or if, there was something he could even do to help the victim. He ran up to the site. He tried to save the victim by digging them out by hand. He dug and dug furiously and panicked, only to realize as he dug down enough to expose half the body that he was far too late to save them. He's not sure how long he just sat and cried, helpless to do anything. Eventually, he got up, and he went to inform the necessary people of the grisly discovery. The staff had already known whom he'd found, too. Apparently, earlier that day, a family had reported their daughter missing to the ski resort staff after she had left the group to catch the ski lift to go boarding back down. When she failed to return after a couple of hours, they were beginning to worry. That worry turned to terror after over 8 hours had passed. What apparently happened was that on her way down the hill while snowboarding, she seemed to have noticed the power pole a little too late. She tried to stop, but she fell headfirst into a hollow hole that had formed at the base of the power pole. Unable to dig herself out from being upside down, she eventually suffocated. She had managed to yank one foot loose from the binding on the snowboard in her desperation. That was the most terrifying part to me, the obvious sign of a struggle before a very panicked death. Officer's warning from Jordan B. I work the graveyard shift in a prison. In this prison, the inmates I work with have all been classified as SMI, also known as severely mentally ill. Some of these individuals are high functioning, but some are very, very low functioning. Some are in for a petty crime and others for extremely severe crimes that I won't even mention here. With the time I've spent as an officer, I've seen a lot of things, ranging from minor accidental self-inflicted wounds to fights, riots, and many deaths, most of which were due to old age. Prisons are a hotbed for paranormal activity, especially at night. This makes sense, of course, if ghosts stick around due to things like unfinished business, guilt, rage, or other reasons, then it isn't very surprising that we deal with a lot of them. Folks from every shift all have their own stories. Most of us have bonded over dealing with the same ghosts, doing the same things. I've honestly become numb to the usual bumps throughout the night, but occasionally I do get spooked when something more than the usual does happen. About a month ago, I was working in one of the houses that held our more high-functioning inmates with a good buddy of mine. We'll call him Officer V. It was well past lights out for the inmates, and most of them were asleep. Officer V and I were monitoring the cell cameras, chatting about random things that didn't pertain to work at all. 2 a.m. rolls around, and the knocking begins. The knocking was coming from the back electrical room that is completely closed off. In order to access this room, you need a special key that is stored in a lockbox with the supervisors. These knocks started off quiet, in sets of 3. Officer V and I were so used to this occurrence by now that we just ignored them and kept talking. About an hour passed, and the knocking got more rapid and loud. I think we both jumped completely out of our chairs, but then the knocking just stopped. We sat back down. Looking around, we saw it. A grayish human figure walking past the outside of our front door toward our Alpha Run and a completely different housing unit. We both froze in place, our eyes locked together as if we both wanted to ask, "Did you see that?" After a moment of silence, I finally found my voice and I asked that exact question. "Did you see that too?" Officer V gave a nervous laugh. I saw it too." He then stood up. "I need to do a security check on all the inmates," he said, leaving the control room. I watched as he went to check on all the sleeping inmates, first on Charlie Run, then Beta. But when he got to Alpha, he had to initiate what we call an ICS. This stands for Incident Command System. Its purpose is to get resources and responses when an incident occurs. Officer V initiated it because one of the inmates was having suicidal ideations. This is common for an SMI yard. What isn't normal is that another ICS happened, not even 10 seconds after the one Officer V called. An inmate was having seizure-like symptoms in the next house over, in the same direction as our Alpha Run, and in the same direction the figure had been moving. I was left alone in our house for a bit after this. The figure did return, and it stood at the end of Alpha Run. It stood there and watched me until right before Officer V came back. As it was standing there, my radio, or what some might call a walkie-talkie, went from having a full battery right to a dead battery within seconds. I haven't seen the figure since that night, but every time I have to work that house, I get that unsettling feeling of being watched. We still don't know if this being caused the accidents, or if it was just trying to warn us. Either way, we know to immediately check on our inmates if we ever see it now.
Persecution from To Hell and Back. In 2019, I took my first official job as a high school English teacher. An easy Google search will reveal where. As it's known as the most haunted city in South Africa. I was 24 at the time, and excited to get out and be a real adult for the first time in my life. A few context clues before we get started on the story. 1. The most affordable accommodation I could find was a suite in a women's dormitory of a school for children with severe special needs. 2. This was not the school I taught at. 3. The school I taught at was a small, severely fundamentalist Christian public school that frequently had to rely on the law to manage the disciplinary infractions of its students. 4. It quite quickly became clear to me that there was no one there at all interested in helping me or even listening to what I had to say. This included my unwitting roommate. 5. Despite the following account, I remain a healthy skeptic to this day. more likely to look for logical explanation to odd occurrences than immediately jump to the supernatural. This story simply cannot be explained by anything logical that I've found. So, let's get into it, shall we? The first thing that I noticed was the heat. Now, this city is one of the hottest places in the country, but somehow, it's always 5 to 10 degrees hotter in my suite, at all times. This made sleep and existence in this room practically impossible. But as a young teacher with a barely livable salary, I had no other choice. More exhausting still, however, was one of the other tenants, an older woman who may for reasons I may never understand, thought it her duty to convert me. At this point, I'd finally begun to shake off, officially, the yoke of Calvinistic Christianity, under which I was raised, out from under my blindly believing family. I was finally free to make up my own mind, and all my introspection led to one clear conclusion. I cannot subscribe to something as illogical, flawed, and dangerous as organized religion. That stuff's more addictive than crack, and just as hard to get clean from. My point being, this woman seemed to smell this on me, and would begin actively waiting for me in places she knew I'd be, to spread the good word. It took me being mean beyond my means to get her to back off finally. But I'm getting ahead of myself. After the heat, it was my front door. You see, this school and its facilities were severely underfunded. This means that maintenance on the building was practically non-existent. You needed something replaced or fixed? Forget about it. One such maintenance issue was the latching on the doors. They simply wouldn't latch. The only way of keeping your doors shut was to lock them. So, I fell into the habit of doing this quite quickly. Not a little in part because God's most devoted had zero compunction about banging my door open to come visit. And through her nonsense and the unbearable heat in my room, and my constant exhaustion and dehydration, I needed to get at least some work done for my students. This all became moot, though, when my door would still sometimes just swing open. I would make a point of locking it and leaving my key in the lock to make sure it wouldn't be unlocked from the outside, and it would simply still open by itself, unlocked and without the handle turning. Never when I tugged on it or checked the integrity of the lock, but by itself, at odd intervals, especially at night. Sure, when it really began to get insane for me was when things started going wrong at school too. I had an incident in my classroom involving one student trying to beat up another with a brick, and me unthinkingly stepping between them to attempt to de-escalate the situation. Not only did I get my one leg bashed up pretty badly, but the principal gave me a disciplinary action for stepping in, instead of calling the school disciplinarian. Cool. I'll just let the kids beat each other to bloody pulps with masonry in the future, while I run around looking for some guy that's barely ever where he's easily locatable. Understood. That same day I noticed the first cross. Well, a crucifix, drawn upside down on the wall above my bed. This is where I should make a few admissions, dear listeners. The main reason for my skepticism isn't because I'm some big proponent for logical thinking above all else, or because I have some deep understanding of the machinations of the world. I used to be a severely sick person before my ADHD and autism were diagnosed. My panic disorder frequently got the better of me and made me highly irrational. It got bad enough that I developed psychosis, and hallucinations were not beyond the scope of my brain's attempts. To alleviate the insistent onslaught of anxiety I had to deal with every second of every day, were not beyond the scope of my brain's attempts. To alleviate the incessant onslaught of anxiety I had to deal with every second of every day. For this reason, it was way easier for me to believe my own insanity, rather than anything tangibly odd or outside the ordinary. I couldn't even bring myself to completely rule out my door randomly opening being a dysfunction of my thoughtfulness, despite triple checking it every time I locked it. So, when the first upside-down crucifix appeared, I was more than comfortable chalking it up to stress-induced psychosis and leaving it at that. I just wish that's where it stopped, but alas. On another day, after the third crucifix had appeared, this one painstakingly scratched into the anti-glare film on my suite's solitary window. My school received a call in which I was being accused of being an incorrigible devil worshipper with an utter disdain for God and all he stood for. Logic, right? I don't believe in Christianity, so I must worship the devil. Like Mr. Lucifer isn't the Christian villain. Why would I believe in the villain if the entire story doesn't strike my fancy? Anyway, it was my neighbor, Miss Head of the Jesus fandom, rebuting after I told her I was crazy enough without needing to add another voice in my head to the mix. God can take a long walk of a short pier. Like I said, cruelty beyond my means. I've never had anything against religion as a concept. My family are all staunch believers and find great comfort in going to church and reading their Bibles. I support them 100% and will gladly go to church with them when they ask. I just don't believe them myself. But by this point, I'd gotten really sick of this woman on top of everything else. I was, in fact, starting to believe all the weird stuff happening to me was her doing. She seemed the type. She was highly irrational on a good day and actively sat waiting for me for hours outside my suite just to give me another sermon on why her faith was the one universal truth. I was considering filing a restraining order. That is, until my stuff started disappearing and reappearing in different places instantly. First, it was water bottles. Like I said, I live in a constant state of dehydration from being so hot and sweaty all the time. So I often drink up to 3 liters of water a day, just to keep up with all the fluid I was losing. But I'd put my bottle down beside my bed before immediately reaching for it again and finding nothing, only to look up and see it sitting 4 meters away on my little table. I was once lesson prepping, and a binder, full of model lesson plans and worksheets and such, slid off my lap and onto the floor, where I could hear it clatter to the linoleum, only for me to have looked down at it. Not a second later to find the entire thing gone. Even the loose sheets of paper piled on top of it, that I was using for reference, would have vanished into thin air. Glancing up to check my surroundings, I found it sitting, closed and with all the papers returned to their correct plastic sleeves, on my nightstand. Then there was the fire. Along with a new job comes taking over some of the financial responsibilities your parents took on when you were a child. One of these was my phone. At this point, I couldn't afford a new phone. Instead, I was living between 2 old broken phones that I kept alive on a month-by-month basis as they, rightfully so, tried to finally move on to the great tech paradise of the universe. Mars, right? That's the one completely inhabited by robots. Anyway, one of the things I had to watch out for with one of these phones was overheating. So, since my room was already a sauna, I could only charge my phone there for a little bit, to give it enough juice for the alarm to wake me up the following morning. Then, I would take it with me to continue charging it at school, where it was much cooler. One night, I woke up to severe pain in my right hand. My eyes flew open, and I sat up with a start, taking in the foul-smelling blaze raging on my area rug, which had begun to burn my hand. I'd forgotten to unplug my phone, and it had been burnt so badly. It caught fire. Freaking out, I took one of my precious bottles of clean water. You cannot drink the tap water in most of this country, and most people either pay for filtered water refills at grocery stores or have water filters installed in their homes, and attempted to douse the flames. But when I turned around, the fire was gone. The smell still filled the room, but I realized then it smelt sulfurous, not really like burning plastic or battery discharge. Plus, the phone was still burnt out, with visible scorch marks and bubbles where the casing had begun to warp from the heat. But lying there in the center of my area rug, it was the only thing damaged. My rug didn't have a mark on it. After this, sleeping in that room became impossible. I was exhausted at work. My teaching was suffering. My department head hated me, and it became clear I wasn't going to be able to stay at that school much longer. Calling my parents proved fruitless. They only told me to tough it out and ask for help from management, which they wouldn't hear wasn't helping me in the slightest. So, trust me when I tell you in my vulnerable state, I had completely given over to my mental illness. I believed I was crazy, useless, beyond help, and I was spiraling towards a very dark place indeed. That's when the scratching started. It was never quiet or gentle. It sounded like there was an animal in my closet, desperately trying to get out. Now, something a lot of people don't talk about is how the coolness under pressure aspect of ADHD, especially untreated ADHD, can hinder just as much as it can help. When I first started hearing the scratching, I was too depleted to move to check it out. Walking from my bed to my front door winded me. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I felt completely isolated and alone. I had no sanctuary anywhere. My family lived 800 kilometers away, but when I would open my closet door at other times, recalling the scratching, I would definitely find scratch marks in the wood, always in the part of the closet for hanging clothes, a little higher than my eye level of 164 centimeters, or 5'4", but never high enough to be level with a crossbar. One night, after coming home from a work event, the scratching was already going when I let myself into my suite. Without blinking, I yanked open the door, foregoing turning on my lights, and plunged my hand into the void of darkness inside. Some kind of shadowy thing came out to greet me though, like a massive black finger with a claw for a nail, and scratched my arm. Despite never scarring, I still have that scar to this day, even though my burn scars from the fire have since faded. I yelped and pulled my arm back, slamming the door shut. I slept with my suite's door open that night. I slept with my suite's door open that night, letting the hall light spill inside. The scratching did not cease once. Finally, the day came when I tendered my resignation from that school. My brother was coming to load up my furniture the next day, and I was going home. I felt so relieved. I can't describe it, even now. Unfortunately, at this point, I have to share one more tidbit about this dormitory I temporarily called home. It did not have working showers or baths. All the showers poured brown sludge instead of water. In fact, the building frequently did not even have water. I was showering at the gym and feeling disgusting the rest of the time. As this was my last night there, however, I already cancelled my gym membership and needed a wash pretty badly. Packing up that sweltering cesspool of a room had left me filthy, and we had received a notification text from the matron that day that one of our baths was fully functional, and we had received a notification text from the matron that day that one of our baths was fully functional. So, I put together my bath things, got undressed, wrapped myself in a towel, and set off down the hall to the bathroom, excited to freshen up, go to sleep, and leave this place as soon as possible. Naturally, as luck and ADHD would have it, I forgot to bring a plastic pitcher with which to wet my hair for shampoo. So, my dumb ass failed the white girl in a horror movie test when I leaned back and slowly submerged my entire body underwater. It was instantaneous. The 2 spots of pressure on my chest came on almost predictably. Opening my eyes, I could clearly see there was no one there. I was completely alone, and yet something was pressing down on me, keeping me underwater. I'd taken quite a big breath before going under, though. So instead of losing my mind and thrashing, I decided to see if I could wait it out. I could. The pressure went away a moment later. When I sat up to grab my shampoo and finish my bath, both my toiletries bag and my towel were gone. vanished, nowhere to be seen. My brother found them the next day, when we lifted and carried out my couch from my room. A couch, mind you, that I lifted up and searched under myself the previous night, when I'd scoured my room to try to find my lost things. It was as I handed over my keys to the matron, and she asked me how my stay had been, that I'd felt free enough to discuss my ordeal. Something in her tone gave me pause. Did the previous occupant of that room report anything strange? I asked her, my brother honking his horn impatiently for us to go. It was fair. We had quite a journey ahead of us. I wouldn't know. It was before my time, the matron answered, not unkindly. I frowned. How long have you been here? 15 years, she answered with a hint of pride. Let me tell you this, though. Did the crosses show up? Suddenly, despite it being 42 degrees out, finally, despite it being 42 Celsius out, I felt ice cold. Crosses? She nodded slowly. When I was new, the previous tenant of your room had just left. The matron before me had been showing me around, and we found the door to your room ajar. Now, the old woman was as formidable as they come, which she need to be in our line of work, but even she wouldn't set foot inside that place. She said there was something dark in there, something inhuman. From where we stood, we'd watched as a crudely drawn, upside-down crucifix slowly faded from one wall. It was then that I recalled not seeing as many of the crosses over the last few days. As though whatever presence I'd been sharing my space with had known I was leaving. Over the course of my 3-month stay, there had been about 8 crosses in various places throughout the room. Some looked like they had been drawn with fatty, dirty fingers on the wall, while others, like the one on my window and on my closet door, had been scratched into each surface. Now, I wouldn't have known how to explain any of that to my brother, so I'd been quite worried about him coming to help me move. But as the matron told her story, I realized I didn't recall seeing the crucifix on my closet door or the one above my room's light switch at any point during my brother and I's comings and goings from the room for the move. I hadn't answered her about the crosses, but I did mention how it probably would be a good idea not to let people live in that suite anymore. She'd only nodded sagely before wishing me luck for the future. As we'd put that city in the rearview mirror, it was like coming out of a long illness. I could suddenly breathe again, and the world had color and life. I don't know what that thing was, the supernatural, or just a severe bout of mental illness. You be the judge. All I do know, though, is I'd never experienced anything like that before or since. Take care of yourselves, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in to Tales from the Break Room, the home of the scariest true work stories. If you want to hear your story narrated by me, send it to me at eeriecast.com/submit. We pay 5 cents per word for accepted stories. Help us grow by leaving Tales from the Break Room a rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app. Check out eeriecast.com or search for EerieCast on those very same podcast apps to see our other exciting and terrifying podcasts, like Unexplained Encounters, the other show I host, where I read stories with a focus on the supernatural. To get some merch, go to eeriecast.store. And to unlock ad-free episodes of your favorite EerieCast shows and exclusive audiobooks, go to eeriecast.com/plus and consider signing up for EerieCast Plus. You can follow me on Twitter, I guess it's X now, @DarkPrevails. You can also subscribe to me on YouTube, where I deliver the same content. Just look for Darkness Prevails. Good night. I hope we can share another break sometime soon.